They locked the most powerful man in England inside the East Wing and waited for him to die. The first time Rosalie Everhart heard the screaming, it was 2:13 in the morning. The sound cut through Blackmere Manor like a blade dragged across stone. Sharp, ragged, wrong. She froze in the servants' corridor with a basket of fresh linens pressed against her chest while every candle along the wall trembled in its brass holder. Then silence swallowed the manor again. Not ordinary silence. The heavy kind. The kind that settled into old houses where terrible things had happened for too many years. Rosalie lowered her eyes and kept walking because that was what invisible girls did at Blackmere Manor. They kept their heads down. They finished their work. The cook lifted her head slowly from the chopping block. The scullery maid nearly dropped a tray of china. Even old Mr. Hargrove, who had worked at Blackmere for 30 years and acted unimpressed by almost everything, went pale beneath his gray beard. Another bell followed immediately, harder this time. Rosalie felt her stomach tighten. The East Wing bell. Nobody spoke for 3 full seconds. Then footsteps exploded overhead. Running. Doors slamming. A woman somewhere upstairs began crying. "Sweet Lord," the cook whispered. "It is the Duke." Rosalie had seen Duke Lucien Blackmere only 3 times in the 3 years she had worked at the manor. Once descending the marble staircase during Christmas while every conversation in the room died the second he appeared. Once crossing the courtyard on horseback beneath pouring rain with his black coat snapping behind him like smoke. And once in the library doorway late at night when she had been dusting shelves alone. He had not looked at her. Powerful men never looked at girls like Rosalie Everhart. But she remembered him anyway. Tall enough to make everyone around him seem smaller. Dark hair streaked with silver at the temples. Broad shoulders. A face carved into hard lines by years nobody dared ask about. He moved quietly for such a large man. That was the frightening part. Men who shouted could be predicted. Men like Lucien Blackmere did not need to raise their voices. The kitchen door burst open. Mrs. Weatherby hurried inside, clutching her skirts with trembling fingers. The housekeeper normally looked like a woman carved from dry wood and discipline. Tonight she looked frightened. Truly frightened. "Nobody goes upstairs," she snapped immediately. "Nobody enters the East Wing unless ordered directly. Is that understood?" Nobody answered fast enough. "Is that understood?" she repeated sharply. A chorus of frightened yes followed. Mrs. Weatherby turned toward the cook. "Boil water. Every pot you have." Then toward the footmen. "Lock the north corridor immediately." Finally her eyes landed on Rosalie for half a second before sliding away again. Rosalie was relieved by that. Attention inside Blackmere Manor usually meant trouble. The housekeeper disappeared as quickly as she arrived. The kitchen erupted into whispers the second the door slammed shut behind her. "I heard he collapsed. The physician came after midnight. They say it is fever. No. Poison. God help us if it spreads." Rosalie stayed quiet while she folded drying towels near the stove. She had learned early that silence kept people comfortable. Quiet girls survived longer. But the whispers kept growing louder. The Duke had locked himself inside the East Wing 3 days earlier. The doctor from town had visited twice. No visitors had been allowed near the corridor since yesterday morning. One servant claimed he heard furniture smashing against the walls. Another swore the Duke had started hallucinating and screaming at people who were not there. "My cousin worked at the Ashbourne estate when the fever came through," one maid whispered. "People died in less than a week." "Do not say that. I am serious. They buried 3 servants in the same grave because there was no room left." Rosalie focused harder on folding linens. Outside, thunder rolled across the cliffs like distant cannon fire. She wanted the conversation to stop. Fear spread quickly in servant halls. Faster than sickness. A sudden crash echoed from the floor above. Several maids gasped. One crossed herself. Then came another sound. A man's voice, raw with pain. Rosalie looked up before she could stop herself. Every face in the kitchen turned toward the ceiling. The screaming started again. Not loud this time. Worse, broken. Like somebody fighting to breathe. One of the younger maids burst into tears. "I want to go home." "Quiet!" the cook snapped, though her own hands shook. Rosalie stared at the dark stairwell leading upward. Something about the sound unsettled her more deeply than fear should have. Powerful men were not supposed to sound helpless. Duke Lucien Blackmere ruled half the northern territories. Men twice her size lowered their eyes when he entered rooms. Newspapers in London called him the Iron Duke because he never bent for anyone. And yet upstairs he sounded alone. The screaming stopped abruptly. Silence returned once more. Heavy. Suffocating. Then the front doors of the manor slammed open. Voices echoed through the entrance hall. Urgent. Panicked. Rosalie stepped into the corridor beside the kitchen just in time to see two physicians climbing the staircase while servants rushed to carry crates upstairs. Behind them stood Lady Vivian Blackmere wrapped in deep emerald silk despite the hour. Beautiful. Cold. Her diamonds glittered beneath candlelight while everyone else looked terrified. She did not look toward the east wing. She looked annoyed. "Seal the corridor entirely," she told the butler. "No one enters without my permission." "My lady," the butler began carefully. His Grace specifically requested. "I do not care what my brother requested." Her voice cut through the hall like ice. "If the fever spreads through this house, we all suffer for it." Rosalie lowered her eyes instantly, but not before she noticed something strange. Lady Vivian was not frightened. Everyone else looked terrified. She looked impatient, as though Duke Lucien Blackmere dying would be inconvenient but manageable. A cold draft swept through the hall. Somewhere upstairs another object shattered violently against a wall. Lady Vivian flinched for the first time. Then she turned sharply toward the staircase. "Keep him restrained if necessary," she said flatly before walking away. Restrained. Rosalie felt something twist uncomfortably inside her chest. An hour later, the servants were ordered into the dining hall. 37 people stood crowded beneath the enormous chandeliers while rain battered the windows overlooking the cliffs. The east wing remained completely dark except for one faint candle burning behind the top floor curtains. Mrs. Weatherby stood at the front of the room with both hands clasped tightly together. "The Duke is gravely ill," she announced. "Until further notice, the East Wing remains under quarantine." Nervous whispers spread immediately. "Any servant wishing to leave the estate may do so before sunrise." The room exploded. "Leave? Without penalty? What about wages? What about references?" Mrs. Weatherby's jaw tightened. "You will receive full recommendation letters and 1 month's compensation." Rosalie looked around slowly. Fear had already made the decision for most of them. She could see it in their eyes. People were calculating survival. Outside, lightning flashed across the cliffs and illuminated the manor windows in pale silver. For one brief second, Rosalie thought she saw a figure standing behind the east wing glass. Tall, motionless, watching the storm alone. Then darkness swallowed the window again. A maid near Rosalie whispered shakily, "They say he locked himself in there because he started seeing dead people." Another answered, "No. They say he went mad after the fever took hold." Rosalie said nothing, but she kept staring at the dark east wing long after everyone else looked away. Because somewhere behind those locked doors, the most feared man in England sounded like he was dying. And for reasons she could not explain, the loneliness in that sound frightened her more than the storm outside. By sunrise, Blackmere Manor had started emptying like a sinking ship. The storm still clawed at the cliffs beyond the estate, but the rain had softened into a cold gray mist that wrapped around the property like smoke. Rosalie stood beside the servants' entrance carrying a crate of firewood when the first carriage rolled away from the manor gates. 2 footmen sat inside beside their wives and children, faces pale beneath heavy wool blankets. Nobody looked back at the house. They looked relieved to escape it. Another carriage followed 20 minutes later. Then another. Horses churned through mud while trunks were loaded in frantic silence across the courtyard. The stable hands avoided eye contact. The maids whispered prayers while tying scarves around their hair. Fear had settled into Blackmere Manor completely now. It lived in every hallway, every staircase, every locked door. Rosalie carried logs through the lower corridor toward the kitchen and nearly collided with Thomas, one of the younger footmen, rushing toward the exit with his coat half-buttoned. "Watch it!" he snapped before recognizing her. His expression softened slightly. "Sorry." Rosalie adjusted the firewood in her arms. "You are leaving?" Thomas gave a humorless laugh. "Half the staff already has." He glanced nervously toward the ceiling as though the Duke might somehow hear them from the East Wing. "You should go too." Rosalie said nothing. Thomas lowered his voice. "I heard the physician tell Mrs. Weatherby the fever is worsening. They cannot get his temperature down." He swallowed hard. "One of the nurses refused to enter the room this morning." Another servant hurried past carrying 2 packed suitcases. Rosalie watched him disappear toward the courtyard. "Where will you go?" she asked quietly. Thomas shrugged. "Anywhere that is not here." Then he leaned closer. "Do you know what I heard last night?" Rosalie wished he would stop talking. Men filled silence with rumors the way frightened children filled darkness with monsters. "They say the Duke tried to claw his way out of the bed restraints." Rosalie stiffened slightly. "Restraints?" Thomas nodded quickly. "The fever has made him delirious. He keeps demanding they unlock the doors. Keeps screaming for someone named Daniel." The name lingered strangely in Rosalie's mind. Before she could ask anything else, Thomas hurried away toward the front gates. Rosalie watched him leave through the fog. Another servant gone. Another pair of footsteps disappearing from the manor forever. By 8 o'clock that morning, nearly half the household staff had fled. The kitchen that normally roared with noise and movement now felt hollow. Empty shelves gaped open where servants had taken supplies before leaving. "Bring fresh towels to the 3rd-floor storage room." Rosalie nodded immediately. "Yes, ma'am." "And stay away from the east corridor." The warning came too fast. Too sharp. Weak this time. Barely more than a rasp carried through the corridor. "Open the door. If he leaves that room in his condition, he will destroy this house before the fever does." Then she turned away. Her perfume lingered behind after she disappeared down the staircase. Roses and winter spice. Cold. Expensive. Empty. Rosalie remained standing motionless beside the wall long after the corridor fell silent again. The chained doors stared back at her. A prison entrance inside one of the wealthiest manors in England. Another cough echoed faintly from behind the wood. Weaker now. Rosalie swallowed hard and forced herself to continue downstairs. She did not belong near the East Wing. She did not belong near dukes or family secrets or locked corridors. Invisible girls survived by staying invisible. But the image refused to leave her mind. Heavy chains wrapped around the handles from the outside. As though everyone inside Blackmere Manor feared what might happen if Lucien Blackmere escaped. That evening, more servants left. By sunset, only 12 remained inside the estate. The manor had grown so quiet Rosalie could hear the grandfather clock ticking from 3 rooms away. Candles burned lower because nobody wanted to waste supplies. Entire hallways remained dark. The storm clouds outside turned the windows black long before nightfall. Rosalie carried a tray of untouched soup back toward the kitchen when she noticed Mrs. Weatherby standing alone beside the servant entrance staring at the falling rain. The older woman's shoulders looked tired. Smaller somehow. Rosalie hesitated before speaking. "The Duke did not eat again?" Mrs. Weatherby shook her head slowly. "No." Her voice sounded strained. "He barely drinks water now." Silence stretched between them. Then Mrs. Weatherby spoke again without turning around. "Do you know what the cruelest thing about powerful families is, Rosalie?" Rosalie blinked in surprise. The housekeeper almost never used her first name. "No, ma'am." Mrs. Weatherby watched rain slide down the window glass. "They teach everyone to fear powerful men. But when those men become weak, their own blood abandons them first." Upstairs, somewhere beyond the locked East Wing, a distant crash echoed once more through the manor darkness. Then silence followed again. Deep, endless, waiting. The East Wing key appeared just after midnight. Rosalie almost missed it. The manor had gone nearly silent by then, except for the endless moaning wind outside and the distant ticking of clocks echoing through empty hallways. Only 9 servants remained inside Blackmere Manor now. The rest had fled before sunset, leaving entire sections of the estate dark and abandoned. Rosalie sat alone near the kitchen stove, mending a torn dish towel beneath weak candlelight while the fire crackled low in the hearth. Her shoulders ached from carrying water buckets all evening. Her fingers smelled faintly of vinegar and smoke. She had just threaded another stitch through the cloth when Mrs. Weatherby entered the kitchen without a sound. The older woman's face looked drawn with exhaustion. Shadows hollowed the skin beneath her eyes. In one hand she carried a lantern. In the other, something small and silver glinted beneath the light. Rosalie lowered the towel slowly. Neither woman spoke at first. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Somewhere above them, a floorboard creaked inside the sleeping manor. Then Mrs. Weatherby crossed the kitchen and placed a heavy iron key onto the wooden table between them. Rosalie stared at it. The key was old, ornate, large enough to fit the chained east wing doors. "What is this?" she asked quietly. Mrs. Weatherby looked toward the dark ceiling before answering. "A mistake," she said tiredly. Rosalie frowned slightly. "Ma'am." The housekeeper pulled out a chair and sat heavily across from her. For the first time since Rosalie had known her, Mrs. Weatherby looked old. Not strict, not frightening, just tired. "I have worked in this house 26 years, she said softly. "I watched Lucien Blackmere grow from a grieving 17-year-old boy into the most feared duke in the north." She paused. "And tonight I listened to his family lock him in a room like an animal." Rosalie looked back down at the key. "The physicians said he is dangerous." Mrs. Weatherby let out a bitter laugh. "No, sick men are inconvenient. There is a difference." The kitchen fire popped sharply. Rosalie folded her hands together tightly in her lap. "Why are you showing me this, Mrs.?" Weatherby's eyes met hers directly. "Because nobody else will go near him." Silence stretched heavily between them. Rosalie looked away first. "I am only a maid." "Exactly." The answer came immediately. "You are invisible. You hear things people do not notice you hearing. You move through this house like smoke." Mrs. Weatherby leaned closer. "And unlike the rest of them, you are not cruel." Rosalie swallowed hard. Upstairs, faintly, another weak crash echoed from the east wing. Then coughing followed. Rough, exhausted, human. Mrs. Weatherby closed her eyes briefly at the sound. "Dr. Whitmore left an hour ago," she said. "Lady Vivian dismissed the second physician after dinner. She says continuing treatment is wasting money." Rosalie felt cold spread slowly through her chest. "But he is still alive." "Barely." Mrs. Weatherby's voice cracked slightly on the last word. That frightened Rosalie more than anything else tonight. Housekeepers did not crack. They survived everything. "The Duke needs water," Mrs. Weatherby continued quietly. "He needs clean linens. Someone should be monitoring his fever." Rosalie stared at the key again. Heavy iron. Cold silver edges worn smooth with age. "Then why don't you go?" Mrs. Weatherby looked down at her own trembling hands. "Because I am afraid." The honesty in those words settled heavily into the room. Rosalie had never heard a superior admit fear before. The older woman inhaled slowly. "You know what people say about Lucien Blackmere?" Rosalie nodded faintly. Everybody knew. The Iron Duke. Ruthless. Cold. Dangerous. Men in town lowered their voices when speaking his name. Mothers warned daughters not to stare at him during church services. Newspapers described him like some dark creature built from war and winter storms. Mrs. Weatherby looked toward the staircase leading upward. "But I also know this. 15 years ago, when influenza swept through Blackmere village, he opened the estate to every sick family in the county." She paused. "And when my husband died, the Duke paid for the funeral himself without telling anyone." Rosalie blinked in surprise. Mrs. Weatherby gave a small tired shake of her head. "Powerful men are rarely gentle. But Lucien Blackmere has never been needlessly cruel." Another silence followed. Then Mrs. Weatherby slid the key slowly across the table toward Rosalie. "If he dies alone in that room, this house deserves to burn." The words settled into Rosalie's chest like stones. Outside, thunder rolled low across the cliffs. She stared at the key for several long seconds. Every instinct told her to refuse. Smart girls survived by staying away from powerful families and their disasters. Smart girls kept their heads down and remained unnoticed. But upstairs a sick man had been chained behind locked doors while his own family counted inheritance papers downstairs. Rosalie thought about the coughing she had heard through the corridor. The weak voice asking someone to open the door. The lonely sound of it. Slowly, she reached for the key. Felt colder than she expected. Mrs. Weatherby stood immediately after Rosalie touched it. Relief and guilt passed across her face so quickly Rosalie almost missed it. "There are fresh bandages in the storage room beside the library," the housekeeper said quietly. "Willow bark tincture in the cabinet near the laundry hall. And—" she hesitated. "Do not let Lady Vivian see you." Rosalie looked up sharply. "Why?" Mrs. Weatherby's expression darkened. "Because Lady Vivian wants control of this estate before the Duke wakes up." Then she turned toward the kitchen door. "If anyone asks where you are, I never saw you tonight." The door closed softly behind her. Rosalie remained alone beside the dying fire for nearly a minute. The key rested heavily in her palm. Upstairs, the manor groaned softly beneath winter wind. Finally she stood. The corridors looked different after midnight. Longer, colder. Candle flames flickered weakly against endless dark walls while old portraits watched silently from their gilded frames. Rosalie moved quietly through the sleeping manor carrying fresh towels beneath one arm and a small lantern in her other hand. Her heartbeat sounded too loud in the silence. She passed dark sitting rooms and abandoned hallways where furniture sat covered beneath white cloth like ghosts waiting patiently for spring. The farther north she walked, the colder the manor became. By the time she reached the third floor, frost coated the corners of the windows overlooking the cliffs. The chained east wing doors stood at the end of the corridor exactly where she had left them earlier. Silent. Waiting. Rosalie stopped several feet away. Fear crawled slowly through her stomach. Not fear of fever. Fear of crossing a line she could never uncross afterward. Once she opened those doors, she would become part of whatever secret the Blackmere family was trying to bury upstairs. Another sound came from inside the wing. Weak coughing. Then silence again. Rosalie tightened her grip on the lantern and stepped forward. The chains rattled softly when she touched them. The noise echoed sharply through the empty corridor. She froze immediately, listening for footsteps. None came. Slowly she inserted the key into the lock. Metal scraped. The old mechanism groaned loudly before finally releasing with a heavy click. Rosalie swallowed hard. Then she pulled the chains away from the handles one careful inch at a time. The doors creaked open into darkness. Cold air spilled immediately into the corridor carrying the sharp scent of sickness, sweat, and medicine. Rosalie lifted the lantern higher and stepped inside. The east wing looked abandoned. Dust-coated tables along the walls. Furniture sat draped beneath white sheets. The long hallway stretched ahead beneath dim candlelight like the inside of a tomb. At the far end stood one partially open doorway. Light flickered weakly beneath it. Rosalie moved carefully down the corridor. Her shoes barely made noise against the carpet runner. The closer she came to the room, the stronger the smell became. Fever. Smoke. Wet linen. Something medicinal beneath it all. Then she heard breathing. Rough. Uneven. She stopped outside the doorway. The lantern shook slightly in her hand. Slowly, Rosalie pushed the door open wider. The room beyond looked nothing like she expected. This was not the chamber of a powerful duke. It looked like a battlefield aftermath. Water basins overflowed beside the bed. Blood-stained cloths lay abandoned across the floor. Medicine bottles crowded the nightstand. One chair had been overturned completely. Another sat broken beside the fireplace. And at the center of the enormous four-poster bed, Duke Lucien Blackmere lay restrained against the mattress with leather straps around both wrists. Rosalie stopped breathing for a second. He looked terrible. His dark hair clung damply against his forehead. Fever had drained all color from his skin except for sharp red heat burning across his cheekbones. His chest rose unevenly beneath tangled blankets while sweat soaked the collar of his nightshirt. One powerful arm strained weakly against the restraint as though he had exhausted himself fighting it hours earlier. But it was his face that unsettled her most. Not frightening, not cruel, broken. Lucien Blackmere turned his head slightly toward the doorway as though sensing movement. His eyes opened halfway, gray, fever-bright, unfocused. For one brief second they locked directly onto hers. Then his breathing hitched painfully and he whispered one ragged sentence into the darkness. "Please, don't lock the door again." Rosalie did not realize she was holding her breath until the Duke started coughing again. The sound tore through the room in rough, uneven bursts that left his chest heaving against the tangled sheets. She set the lantern down immediately and crossed toward the bed before fear could stop her. Up close, the heat rolling off him felt unnatural. Fever radiated from his skin hard enough to warm the cold air around the mattress. Rosalie reached carefully toward the damp cloth abandoned near the water basin and frowned. The water inside had gone completely cold hours ago. Nobody had changed it. Nobody had stayed. Lucien shifted weakly against the restraints. His eyes remained half open but unfocused, clouded with exhaustion and fever. "Do not." His voice scraped painfully in his throat. "Do not let them lock it again." Rosalie glanced toward the leather straps securing his wrists to the bedposts. The sight made something tighten painfully inside her chest. Whoever tied them had done it hastily. One restraint had rubbed the skin along his wrist raw from struggling. Not bleeding, just angry red against fever-pale skin. She forced herself to focus. Panic helped nobody. Her grandmother used to say that sick rooms belong to calm people or they belong to death. Rosalie dipped the cloth into clean water and wrung it out carefully before pressing it against his forehead. Lucien inhaled sharply at the coolness. His body relaxed by the smallest amount beneath the blankets. "Easy," she whispered before realizing she had spoken aloud. The Duke went still. Slowly, his unfocused gaze shifted toward her face again. "Who?" The word broke apart beneath exhausted breathing. "Who are you?" Rosalie hesitated. Nobody important had asked her name in years. "Rosalie," she answered quietly. "I work here." Lucien stared at her for several long seconds as though trying to hold onto the sound. Then another tremor rolled through his body. His teeth clenched hard enough for the muscles along his jaw to tighten visibly. Fever chills. Rosalie moved quickly toward the fireplace and added fresh logs to the dying flames. The room brightened slightly beneath orange firelight. Shadows danced across dark wood walls lined with bookshelves and heavy curtains. This had once been a beautiful room. Powerful, masculine. Now it looked abandoned. A battlefield after everyone important had already left. Rosalie noticed untouched trays of food scattered across nearby tables. Most had spoiled completely. One glass of water had frozen slightly near the window from the cold. Her stomach turned quietly. Nobody had cared enough to maintain even the smallest comforts for him. She crossed back to the bed carrying fresh water. "You need to drink." Lucien did not respond immediately. His eyes had drifted shut again. Rosalie slipped one hand carefully beneath his shoulder and lifted him slightly against the pillows. Even weakened by fever, he felt heavy, solid, built like someone accustomed to carrying armor and responsibility for too many years. The scent of cedar smoke and sweat clung faintly to him beneath the sickness. Lucien's breathing roughened sharply when she touched him. His eyes opened instantly, alert for one terrifying second. Gray eyes locked onto hers with enough force to make her freeze completely. There he was, the man people feared, even half-conscious and restrained to a bed. Lucien Blackmere carried something dangerous inside him. Something cold and powerful and used to being obeyed. "Where is Whitmore?" he demanded roughly. Rosalie swallowed. The physician left earlier. A dark expression crossed his face immediately. Not fear. Anger. Of course he did. His voice cracked painfully on the last word. Then exhaustion swept over him again just as quickly. Rosalie handed him the glass carefully. "Drink slowly." Lucien stared at her another second before obeying without argument. The realization startled her more than it should have. Powerful men were not supposed to obey maids. He drank only a little before coughing interrupted him again. Water spilled down his chin onto the blankets. Rosalie grabbed a towel automatically and wiped it away before thinking about what she was doing. The moment her fingers brushed his skin, Lucien went completely still. So did she. The room suddenly felt too quiet, too close. Rosalie pulled her hand back immediately. "Sorry." Lucien kept watching her. Fever burned in his eyes, but something else lingered beneath it now. Confusion, maybe, or disbelief. "You stayed," he said hoarsely. Rosalie looked down at the towel in her hands. "Someone should." The words slipped out before she could stop them. Silence followed. Outside, wind howled against the cliffs hard enough to shake the windows. Somewhere deep inside the manor, one of the grandfather clocks chimed 2 in the morning. Lucien's gaze drifted toward the dark ceiling. "How many left?" Rosalie hesitated. She did not want to answer honestly, but lying felt pointless in this room. "Most of the staff." A humorless sound escaped him. Not quite a laugh. "And my family?" Rosalie remained quiet too long. Lucien closed his eyes slowly. "I see." There was no surprise in his voice. That hurt more somehow. Rosalie busied herself changing the cold water basin because she did not know what to say to a man abandoned by everyone who should have loved him. She worked carefully around the room, gathering spoiled trays and replacing damp towels while Lucien drifted in and out of restless consciousness behind her. Several times he muttered names she did not recognize. Daniel. Eleanor. Once he whispered the word sorry so softly she almost thought she imagined it. The fever worsened as the hours crawled forward. By 3:30 his breathing had become dangerously uneven again. Sweat soaked through his collar and darkened the sheets beneath him. Rosalie knelt beside the medicine cabinet searching through bottles until she found willow bark tincture. Her grandmother used it during fever seasons in Kent. Not a cure, but sometimes enough to ease suffering. She poured a careful dose into fresh water and returned to the bed. Lucien was trembling harder now. His hands strained weakly against the restraints during another fever dream. "Do not let him take the boy," he rasped suddenly. "Please." Rosalie frowned slightly. The boy, the same child he had called for earlier. Daniel. She pressed the glass carefully into his hand. "Drink this." Lucien obeyed automatically again. Half asleep, half drowning in fever. Afterward he slumped back against the pillows breathing hard. Rosalie adjusted the blankets higher across his chest. The movement exposed more of the restraint digging into his wrist. She stared at it quietly for several seconds. Then she reached toward the buckle. Lucien's eyes opened instantly, sharp despite the fever. "No." Rosalie froze. "It is hurting you." His jaw tightened. "Leave them." "Why?" Lucien looked away toward the dark window. For the first time since entering the room, genuine fear crossed his face. Real fear. "Because if they come back while I am delirious." His voice weakened briefly. "I might hurt someone." Rosalie stared at him in silence. The words did not sound arrogant. They sounded ashamed. Another tremor passed through his body. Rosalie reached for a clean cloth instead and wrapped it carefully around the irritated skin beneath the restraint to stop further rubbing. Lucien watched her through half-lidded eyes. "You are not frightened of me," he murmured eventually. Rosalie focused on tying the cloth gently into place. "I think you are more frightened than I am right now." For one brief second, something almost human flickered across his exhausted face. Not amusement exactly, but close. Then the fever pulled him under again. Near dawn, Rosalie finally noticed the injection marks. 3 small bruises lined the inside of Lucien's left arm just beneath the sleeve of his nightshirt. Fresh, precise. Her stomach tightened immediately. She touched one lightly with careful fingers. Not accidental. Deliberate. Lucien stirred weakly beneath her hand. Whitmore, he whispered bitterly through the fever haze. Rosalie looked toward the medicine bottles cluttering the nearby table. Her grandmother had once warned her about physicians who treated wealthy patients like experiments instead of people. Too much medicine could break a body faster than sickness itself. Another cold feeling slid slowly through her chest. She glanced back at Lucien sleeping restlessly against the pillows. The restraints, the locked doors, the injections. None of it felt right anymore. A sudden sound interrupted her thoughts. Footsteps. Somewhere beyond the East Wing corridor. Rosalie extinguished the lantern instantly and turned toward the doorway. The footsteps paused outside the room. Her pulse hammered painfully. Then came the faint rattle of chains at the far entrance to the East Wing. Someone checking the locks. Rosalie remained frozen beside the bed while silence swallowed the corridor again. Several seconds passed. Then the footsteps retreated slowly into the manor darkness. Only after they disappeared completely did Rosalie breathe again. Behind her, Lucien shifted weakly against the pillows. His fever-bright eyes opened halfway. He looked directly at her through the darkness and whispered one rough, exhausted sentence. "Do not let them send me back to sleep." Morning arrived without sunlight. Thick gray clouds swallowed the sky above Blackmere Manor completely, turning the windows pale and colorless like old bones. Rosalie had not slept. She sat beside the dying fireplace in the East Wing chamber with a damp cloth folded between tired hands while Duke Lucien Blackmere drifted through another restless fever dream behind her. The room smelled of smoke, medicine, and rain-soaked stone. Every few minutes the old manor creaked beneath winter wind sweeping across the cliffs outside. Rosalie stared into the fire and tried not to think about the footsteps from the corridor hours earlier. Someone had checked the chains. Someone wanted to make certain the Duke remained locked inside this room. Lucien stirred suddenly against the pillows. His breathing roughened. Rosalie crossed to the bed immediately. Fever still burned through him, though slightly less violently than before. She touched the back of her fingers lightly against his forehead. Hot, but not burning like earlier in the night. The willow bark had helped a little. His eyes opened slowly beneath dark lashes damp with sweat. This time they focused on her almost immediately. Gray. Sharp despite exhaustion. "You are still here." His voice sounded rough from fever and disuse. Rosalie reached for the water glass beside the bed. "You needed someone to monitor your fever." Lucien watched her quietly while she helped him sit up enough to drink. Morning light filtered weakly through heavy curtains behind him, painting sharp silver across the hard angles of his face. Without the violence of fever twisting his expression, he looked different today. Older maybe, more tired. The frightening edge remained. She doubted it would ever disappear completely. But beneath it she could finally see the weight of exhaustion carved into him. Lucien drank slowly this time. His hand trembled slightly around the glass. "How long?" he asked. "Since yesterday evening." His jaw tightened faintly. "No. How long have I been locked in here?" Rosalie hesitated. 3 days. Silence followed immediately. Lucien stared toward the frost-covered windows without speaking. Rosalie saw the answer settle inside him piece by piece. The missing time, the abandoned room, the restraints. His family had left him here long enough for dust to gather on untouched furniture. Long enough for food trays to rot beside the fireplace. "Whitmore drugged me," he said finally. Not confusion. Certainty. Rosalie looked toward the faint bruises along his arm. "I saw the injections." Lucien gave a bitter nod. He claimed they were to control the fever. His expression darkened slightly. "But every time he gave them to me, I lost hours." He leaned back against the pillows, breathing carefully through lingering weakness. "What day is it?" "Thursday." Lucien closed his eyes briefly. "God." Rosalie adjusted the blankets carefully across his shoulders. "You should rest." A humorless sound escaped him. "Rest appears to be the one thing everyone in this house is determined to force upon me." Despite herself, Rosalie almost smiled. The expression vanished quickly before he noticed. But Lucien noticed anyway. His fever-dulled gaze lingered on her face a second longer than before. "Rosalie Everhart," he murmured quietly. Hearing her full name in his voice startled her more than it should have. Nobody at Blackmere Manor used servants' surnames. "Yes, Your Grace." Lucien studied her silently. "How long have you worked here?" 3 years. 3 years, he repeated softly. His eyes drifted slowly around the room. "And I never knew your name." The words landed heavier than she expected. Not arrogance. Regret. Rosalie looked down at the towel in her hands. "That is normal for houses like this." Lucien frowned faintly. "No, it should not be." Another silence stretched between them. Outside, distant thunder rolled softly across the cliffs. Rosalie moved toward the fireplace to add fresh wood while Lucien watched her in quiet thought. The room felt different now that he was more awake. Less like a sick room. More dangerous somehow. This was the real Lucien Blackmere emerging beneath the fever. Intelligent. Observant. A man accustomed to controlling every room he entered. Even weakened by illness, he missed very little. "You are not frightened of me either," he said eventually. Rosalie glanced back toward him. "I was." Past tense. She adjusted another log carefully into the fire. "You look less frightening when someone abandons you in a locked room." Lucien stared at her for several seconds after that. Then something unexpected happened. He laughed. Quietly. The sound roughened into a cough halfway through, but it was unmistakably a laugh. Rosalie froze in surprise. She had never imagined the Iron Duke laughing. Lucien leaned back against the pillows, breathing harder after the coughing fit subsided. "You speak honestly," he said. "That is rare in this house." Rosalie lowered her eyes. "Most people are careful around powerful men. And you are not?" "I am a maid." She shrugged faintly. "People do not usually notice what I say." Something unreadable crossed Lucien's face at those words. Before he could answer, footsteps echoed faintly somewhere beyond the East Wing corridor. Rosalie stiffened immediately. Lucien noticed at once. "Who?" "I do not know." She extinguished one of the nearby candles instinctively. Both listened carefully while the footsteps approached slowly through the corridor outside. Then voices followed. "Lady Vivian." Rosalie recognized the cold, smooth tone instantly. "The solicitor arrives by noon," Lady Vivian was saying. "I want every document prepared before then." Another voice answered nervously. "My lady, perhaps we should wait. If his grace recovers." "He will not." The certainty in her voice chilled the room instantly. Rosalie glanced toward Lucien. His expression had gone completely still. Dangerous stillness. The estate transfers become complicated if he remains alive but incapacitated. Lady Vivian continued calmly outside the door. "We must act before the physicians change their opinions." Lucien's hand tightened slowly against the blankets. Rosalie could almost feel anger radiating from him now. Cold. Controlled. Worse than shouting. The voices outside moved farther down the corridor. Then silence returned again. Lucien stared toward the doorway for a long time after the footsteps disappeared. "Interesting," he said quietly. Rosalie looked toward him carefully. "Your Grace." He turned his head slowly toward her. Fever still weakened him physically, but the sharp intelligence in his eyes had fully returned now. "Vivian never makes financial decisions before consulting attorneys." His voice remained calm. Too calm. "If she summons solicitors before my death certificate exists." He stopped speaking abruptly. Rosalie felt unease twist slowly through her stomach. "You think something is wrong?" Lucien looked toward the injection bruises along his arm. "I think my sister intends to inherit Blackmere before I wake up." The room suddenly felt colder despite the fire. Rosalie crossed toward the medicine table again and began organizing bottles simply to steady her thoughts. One label caught her attention immediately. Laudanum. Another unfamiliar vial sat beside it without markings. Half empty. She picked it up carefully. Lucien noticed instantly. "What is that?" "I do not know." She uncorked it slightly and frowned. Bitter smell. Metallic underneath. Wrong somehow. Lucien's expression darkened further. Whitmore brought that bottle 2 nights ago. Rosalie set it down carefully. Her pulse had begun beating faster again. Everything about the East Wing felt wrong now. The restraints, the injections, the locked doors, the hurried solicitors. None of it resembled ordinary illness anymore. Lucien shifted against the pillows with visible effort. "Help me stand." Rosalie turned immediately. "No." His eyebrows lifted slightly. "No. You nearly collapsed drinking water 20 minutes ago. I need to see the study. You need to stay alive first." The answer slipped out before she could soften it. Lucien stared at her in stunned silence. Probably because nobody spoke to dukes that way. Rosalie regretted the words instantly. "Sorry. I only meant—" "No." Lucien interrupted quietly. "You meant exactly what you said." His gaze lingered on her face again, searching, measuring. Then unexpectedly he obeyed. He leaned back against the pillows instead of arguing further. The realization unsettled Rosalie more than his anger would have. Powerful men were not supposed to listen to servants. Another hour passed slowly. Rosalie changed fresh cloths across his forehead and forced him to eat several spoonfuls of broth despite his irritation. Outside, the storm finally began weakening into light freezing rain. Pale morning light filtered farther into the room now, revealing more details hidden during the night. Books stacked carelessly near the fireplace. A silver-framed photograph turned face down on the desk. Mud still dried along Lucien's boots near the doorway, as though he had entered the room only briefly before collapsing days ago. Rosalie crossed quietly toward the desk while Lucien rested with eyes closed. She adjusted a fallen stack of papers automatically. Then voices drifted faintly upward through the floorboards below. Men talking in the main hall. One voice belonged to Lady Vivian. Another sounded unfamiliar. Rosalie moved closer toward the heating vent near the wall instinctively. "Cannot delay much longer," Lady Vivian was saying downstairs. "If the Duke dies intestate." The unfamiliar man lowered his voice too much for Rosalie to hear clearly. Then Lady Vivian answered sharply. "The staff will say nothing. Most already fled." Rosalie's stomach tightened. Papers rustled below. "And the maid?" the man asked faintly. Rosalie froze completely. Silence followed downstairs. Then Lady Vivian laughed softly. Cold. Dismissive. "Servants are furniture, Mr. Carter. Nobody notices them." Upstairs in the East Wing chamber, Lucien Blackmere slowly opened his eyes and looked directly at Rosalie standing beside the vent. The room remained silent for one long, terrible second. Then Lucien said quietly, with frightening calm, "Tell me exactly what my sister just said." Rosalie repeated every word exactly. She stood near the heating vent with cold fingers wrapped tightly around the edge of the desk while Lucien listened from the bed in complete silence. The room felt smaller somehow after hearing Lady Vivian speak downstairs. Darker. More dangerous. When Rosalie finished, the Duke did not respond immediately. He stared toward the ceiling for several long seconds, breathing slow and controlled despite the fever still weakening him. Then he looked toward the medicine bottles near the bedside table. "Carter is not a solicitor," he said quietly. Rosalie frowned. "Who is he?" "Financial recovery." His mouth hardened slightly around the words. "He purchases estates after wealthy families collapse." Cold spread slowly through Rosalie's stomach. "Your sister is preparing for your death." Lucien's expression did not change. "No." His voice remained frighteningly calm. "She is preparing for my replacement." Another silence settled heavily into the room. Outside, freezing rain whispered against the windows while distant thunder rolled farther out over the cliffs. The storm was finally passing. But inside Blackmere Manor, something worse had begun. Rosalie crossed toward the fireplace and adjusted another log into the flames simply to steady herself. "What will you do?" Lucien studied her quietly before answering. "First, I survive." The words should have sounded dramatic. Instead, they sounded practical, like a man listing responsibilities. Rosalie glanced back toward him. Fever still burned faintly beneath his skin. Dark shadows hollowed the area beneath his eyes from exhaustion. He looked less like an untouchable duke now and more like someone who had carried too much weight alone for too many years. "You need more rest," she said softly. Lucien almost looked annoyed by the reminder. "You continue speaking to me as though I am ordinary." Rosalie lowered her gaze automatically. "Sorry, Your Grace. Do not apologize." The answer came immediately. Rosalie looked back up in surprise. Lucien shifted carefully against the pillows, grimacing slightly from lingering weakness. "Nobody has spoken honestly to me in years." Something about the quiet exhaustion in his voice unsettled her more deeply than anger would have. Rosalie busied herself cleaning the cluttered medicine table while Lucien rested with half-closed eyes behind her. The room slowly brightened beneath weak morning light filtering through the curtains. Dust floated through the air near the windows. Somewhere beyond the locked east wing corridor, distant servants moved carefully through the manor, beginning another fearful day. Rosalie uncorked the unlabeled medicine vial again and frowned harder this time. Bitter metallic scent. Sharp underneath. Wrong. Her grandmother once treated a farmhand poisoned by spoiled well water. The smell had been similar. She turned the bottle slightly toward the light. Tiny dark sediment clung near the bottom. Not normal. Lucien noticed her expression instantly. "What is it?" Rosalie hesitated. "I do not think this medicine belongs in a fever treatment." Lucien's eyes sharpened immediately despite exhaustion. "Bring it here." She carried the vial carefully toward the bed. Lucien lifted it weakly, examining the contents beneath pale morning light. His jaw tightened slowly. "This was not in the cabinet before I became ill." Rosalie watched him carefully. "Do you know what it is?" "No." He handed it back carefully. But Whitmore insisted on personally preparing every injection himself. Silence followed. Rosalie looked again toward the faint bruises along his arm. "Your fever became worse after the injections?" Lucien nodded once. "Every time." The realization settled heavily between them. Rosalie suddenly understood why the restraints frightened him so deeply. It was not only the fever. It was helplessness. Somebody had turned the most powerful man in Blackmere Manor into a prisoner inside his own home. A sharp knock echoed suddenly through the east wing corridor outside. Both froze instantly. Another knock followed. Harder this time. "Your Grace." Dr. Whitmore's voice carried faintly through the locked doors. Rosalie's pulse jumped painfully. Lucien's expression darkened immediately. "Hide the bottle," he said quietly. Rosalie moved fast. She slipped the unlabeled vial beneath folded towels inside the cabinet just as another knock rattled the corridor. "Your Grace, if you are awake, I must examine you." Lucien leaned back against the pillows, exhaustion settling visibly across his features again. But when he spoke, his voice regained enough cold authority to chill the room instantly. "Leave." Silence followed outside the door. Then Dr. Whitmore answered carefully. "Your sister requested another treatment." Lucien's gray eyes hardened. "And I just refused one." Another pause. Rosalie held her breath completely still near the fireplace. Finally footsteps retreated slowly down the corridor. Only after they vanished entirely did she exhale again. Lucien closed his eyes briefly. "He knows I am awake now." Rosalie stared toward the locked doorway uneasily. "Is that dangerous?" Lucien opened his eyes again. "Everything in this house is dangerous now." Late that afternoon, Mrs. Weatherby slipped quietly into the east wing carrying fresh linens and bread hidden beneath folded blankets. The housekeeper nearly dropped the tray when she realized Lucien was fully conscious. "Your Grace." Shock crossed her tired face instantly. Lucien gave a faint nod from the bed. "Mrs. Weatherby." The older woman's eyes filled unexpectedly with relief before she regained composure. "Thank God." She set the tray down quickly and crossed toward the bedside. "You gave us quite a fright, sir." Lucien glanced briefly toward Rosalie standing near the fireplace. Apparently only one person remained frightened long enough to stay. Mrs. Weatherby looked toward Rosalie then. Something warm flickered across her face for the first time in days. Pride maybe, or gratitude. The "The staff believes you are dying," she told Lucien quietly. Lady Vivian encouraged the rumors. Lucien accepted the information without visible surprise. "How many servants remain?" 8. Mrs. Weatherby hesitated. "Several are already packing to leave before the week ends." Lucien looked toward the frost-covered windows. "Reasonable." Rosalie noticed something strange then. He did not sound angry at the servants for leaving, only tired. Mrs. Weatherby lowered her voice carefully. "Your Grace, there is something else." Lucien looked back toward her. "Speak." The housekeeper glanced once toward the locked doors before continuing. "Last night Lady Vivian ordered your study sealed." Lucien's face went completely still. Rosalie had begun recognizing that expression now. Stillness before danger. "Who gave the order?" "Mr. Carter." Mrs. Weatherby's hands tightened together. "They removed account books before dawn." Lucien's breathing slowed carefully. Too carefully. "How many ledgers?" 3. Rosalie watched understanding settle slowly across his face. Whatever those books contained mattered. A great deal. Mrs. Weatherby continued nervously. "And this morning, one of the downstairs clerks disappeared." Rosalie frowned slightly. "Disappeared?" The housekeeper nodded. "No note. No luggage." His room was empty by breakfast. Another silence filled the room. Lucien stared toward the fireplace flames for several long seconds before speaking quietly. "They are cleaning the house." The words sent cold down Rosalie's spine. Mrs. Weatherby looked frightened again now. "What should we do?" Lucien turned his head slowly toward Rosalie instead of answering immediately. His fever had faded enough now for the full force of his attention to feel almost unsettling. Calm, precise, intelligent. "Rosalie," he said quietly, "when you worked downstairs, did people speak freely around you?" She blinked slightly. "Usually." "Why?" The answer came automatically. "Because servants are invisible." Something cold flickered behind Lucien's eyes. "Good." Rosalie frowned faintly. Good was not the word she would have chosen. Lucien shifted carefully upright despite visible exhaustion. "I need information before Vivian realizes I am thinking clearly again." Mrs. Weatherby immediately looked alarmed. "Your Grace, you can barely stand." "Then I will think sitting down." His gaze remained fixed on Rosalie. "And she will listen." The room went silent. Rosalie stared at him in disbelief. "Me? You move through this manor unnoticed." Lucien's voice stayed calm. "Nobody fears maids. That makes them dangerous." Rosalie opened her mouth to protest but stopped. Because he was right. She had spent 3 years fading quietly through Blackmere Manor while wealthy people discussed secrets directly in front of her face. Nobody remembered servants afterward. They remembered chandeliers and wine and each other. Never the girl replacing candles beside the wall. Lucien watched her carefully. "Can you do it?" Rosalie looked down at her roughened hands. Then toward the locked doors. Then back at the exhausted man abandoned inside his own home while his family prepared to erase him completely. "Yes," she answered softly. Lucien studied her for one long quiet moment. Then something shifted slightly in his expression. Respect, perhaps. Or trust beginning where neither expected it. A sudden crash exploded somewhere deep below the manor. All three startled instantly. Voices erupted faintly downstairs. Running footsteps followed. Mrs. Weatherby turned sharply toward the corridor. "What now?" Another sound echoed upward through the heating vents. Smoke alarms. Rosalie smelled it a second later. Burning paper. Lucien's face hardened immediately. "The records room." Mrs. Weatherby's eyes widened in horror. "Dear God." Lucien swung his legs weakly toward the edge of the bed despite the fever still draining color from his face. Rosalie moved toward him instantly. "What are you doing?" His gray eyes locked onto hers with sudden cold intensity. "If Vivian is burning records now." He pushed himself shakily upright. "Then she is afraid of what they contain." Smoke reached the east wing before the shouting did. Thick, bitter. Burning paper carried through the heating vents and curled slowly beneath the locked doors like a warning. Rosalie moved instinctively toward the corridor while Lucien forced himself upright against the side of the bed with visible effort. The movement nearly dropped him back onto the mattress. His hand tightened hard against the carved bedpost as dizziness swept across his face. Rosalie crossed to him immediately. "You cannot go downstairs like this. Watch me." His voice sounded rough but steady enough to send a chill through the room anyway. He pushed himself to standing before she could argue further. The effort left him pale beneath the fever. One hand braced against the edge of the desk while his breathing turned uneven for several seconds. Rosalie stared at him in disbelief. The Iron Duke looked one strong wind away from collapsing. Yet somehow the room still bent around his presence. Even weak, Lucien Blackmere carried authority like other men carried weapons. Mrs. Weatherby moved quickly toward the doorway. "I will see what happened." Lucien stopped her instantly. "No." The word cracked through the room with enough cold command to freeze both women in place. Lucien steadied himself carefully before continuing. "If Vivian started the fire, she will already have people watching the corridors." His eyes shifted toward Rosalie instead. "But no one watches servants." Rosalie felt her pulse quicken. "You want me to go downstairs? I want you to listen." Lucien lowered himself slowly into the nearby armchair with controlled exhaustion. The effort clearly cost him. Sweat dampened his temples almost immediately afterward. "Find out what burned. Find out who saw it happen. Then come back here." Mrs. Weatherby looked uneasy. "Your Grace, perhaps we should wait until nightfall." Lucien's gaze turned icy. "And give my sister more time to erase evidence?" The housekeeper fell silent instantly. Rosalie hesitated only another second before nodding. "I will go." Lucien looked toward her carefully. "Do not take risks." Something about the quiet seriousness in his voice unsettled her unexpectedly. She lowered her eyes quickly. "Yes, Your Grace." The corridors below had become chaos by the time Rosalie reached the first floor. Smoke still lingered faintly through the southern hallways while frightened servants rushed between rooms carrying water buckets and damp cloths. Somewhere near the west corridor, two footmen argued loudly about whether the fire had spread into the archives. Nobody noticed Rosalie moving quietly through the confusion with her head lowered and a basket of linens balanced against one hip. Invisible girls belonged in busy hallways. That was the advantage. People stopped seeing servants once they carried cleaning supplies. Rosalie reached the records corridor just as Dr. Whitmore emerged from the smoke-darkened doorway, adjusting his gloves nervously. His silver hair looked damp with sweat despite the cold manor air. Behind him, Mr. Carter spoke sharply to one of the remaining staff. "Everything damaged must be removed immediately." Rosalie slowed her pace without appearing to stop. The records room door stood open several feet away. Inside, blackened papers littered the stone floor while smoke curled faintly from a ruined filing cabinet. The fire had been contained quickly. Too quickly. Almost controlled. Dr. Whitmore lowered his voice carefully toward Carter. "This was reckless." Carter's expression hardened. "It was necessary. And if the Duke survives?" Carter glanced sharply toward the surrounding servants before answering quietly. "Then he never learns what disappeared." Cold spread through Rosalie's chest. She continued folding towels from the basket automatically while listening. Dr. Whitmore removed his spectacles with trembling fingers. Lady Vivian promised the sedatives would keep him unconscious another 2 days. Sedatives. Not fever medicine. Sedatives. Rosalie kept her face lowered carefully. Carter's tone sharpened. "Then perhaps you should have increased the dosage." Dr. Whitmore looked suddenly horrified. "I never agreed to kill him." "No." Carter's expression turned cold. "You only agreed to weaken him until legal control transferred." Rosalie felt her grip tighten invisibly around the towels. Footsteps echoed suddenly from the nearby corridor. Lady Vivian appeared moments later wearing dark burgundy silk and irritation sharp enough to cut through the smoke-filled air. "Why are servants still standing here?" she demanded instantly. Everyone scattered immediately. Rosalie lowered her head further and moved toward the hallway beside the laundry room. But she slowed just enough to keep hearing the conversation behind her. The fire destroyed only half the ledgers, Carter muttered. Several transaction books survived. Lady Vivian's jaw tightened visibly. Then burn the rest tonight. Dr. Whitmore stepped back immediately. No more fires. Lady Vivian rounded on him with icy fury. Then perhaps you should have ensured my brother remained unconscious long enough for this transition to finish cleanly. Rosalie nearly stopped walking. Transition. Not recovery. Not protection. Replacement. She turned the corner quickly before anyone noticed her listening. Her heart beat painfully hard now beneath her ribs. Lucien had been right. This was never about illness. It was about power. Rosalie moved deeper into the servants' corridors and nearly collided with Thomas near the stairwell. The young footman looked pale and shaken. Rosalie. He glanced nervously over his shoulder before lowering his voice. You stayed. For now. Thomas rubbed one trembling hand through his hair. You should leave tonight. Why? He leaned closer. One of the downstairs clerks tried to report the missing records this morning. Rosalie felt cold immediately. What happened to him? Thomas swallowed hard. Nobody knows. The answer frightened her more than if he had lied. A loud crash echoed from somewhere upstairs. Both looked up instinctively. Then came shouting. Male voices this time. Angry. Rosalie frowned. What was that? Thomas looked toward the main staircase nervously. Lady Vivian locked the Duke's study after the fire. One of the staff tried entering anyway. Another crash interrupted him. Then silence followed. Heavy. Tense. Rosalie suddenly realized something terrifying. If Lucien regained enough strength to leave the East Wing before Vivian expected, everything inside Blackmere Manor would explode. And somehow she had become trapped directly in the center of it. By late afternoon, the manor had fallen into uneasy quiet again. Smoke faded from the hallways. Servants avoided eye contact. Lady Vivian remained locked inside meetings with Carter and two attorneys who arrived shortly after noon. Rosalie carried fresh broth and clean bandages back toward the East Wing beneath gathering evening shadows. The locked corridor felt colder now than it had the night before. More dangerous because she understood the truth hiding inside it. Lucien was no longer merely sick. He was being erased carefully while still alive. Rosalie unlocked the chains quickly and slipped inside the East Wing before anyone noticed. The moment she entered the chamber, Lucien looked up from the armchair beside the fire. Relief flickered briefly across his face before disappearing so fast she almost missed it. The realization unsettled her immediately. He had been waiting for her return. Mrs. Weatherby sat nearby mending torn linens. She rose quietly the second Rosalie entered. I will check the kitchens. Lucien nodded once without taking his eyes off Rosalie. The door closed softly behind the housekeeper. Silence settled over the room again. Firelight flickered across dark bookshelves while evening rain tapped gently against the windows. Lucien looked exhausted. More alert than yesterday but drained from whatever strength standing earlier had cost him. Tell me. Rosalie set the tray down carefully before speaking. She repeated every conversation exactly. Carter. The ledgers. The sedatives. The missing clerk. Lucien listened without interrupting once. But the colder his expression became, the more dangerous the room felt around him. When she finished, silence stretched heavily between them. Lucien stared into the fireplace for several long seconds before speaking quietly. Whitmore always hated debt. Rosalie blinked slightly. What? His gambling debts nearly destroyed him 4 years ago. Lucien's voice remained calm. Too calm. Vivian paid them. Understanding settled slowly through Rosalie's chest. She bought him. Lucien nodded once. And Carter buys ruined estates after wealthy families collapse. He leaned back carefully against the chair. Together they create very profitable disasters. The fire cracked sharply between them. Rosalie looked toward the surviving ledgers stacked across the desk nearby. What was in the records they burned? Lucien's gray eyes lifted slowly toward her. Proof. Of what? He watched her for one long quiet second. Then he answered softly. That my father left Blackmere to someone else before he died. The room seemed to still completely. Rosalie stared at him in confusion. But you inherited the estate. Yes. Lucien's expression darkened slightly. Because the original heir disappeared 20 years ago. Rosalie felt unease curl slowly through her stomach. The boy you kept calling for during the fever. Lucien went very still. Outside, thunder rolled softly across the distant cliffs again. Then he looked directly at her and said the words that changed everything. Daniel Blackmere is alive. For several seconds, Rosalie forgot how to breathe. The fire cracked softly beside them while winter rain slid down the tall east wing windows in silver streams. Lucien remained seated in the armchair across from her, pale from lingering fever, one hand resting against the carved wooden armrest as though holding himself steady through exhaustion alone. But his eyes never left hers. Gray, sharp, completely awake now. Daniel Blackmere died when he was 6, Rosalie whispered finally. Lucien's expression darkened faintly. That is what the newspapers reported. Rosalie tried to understand. Everybody in England knew the story. 20 years ago, the Blackmere heir vanished during a hunting trip near the northern cliffs. Search parties found blood near the rocks below the estate. No body, no witnesses. After 6 months, the child had been declared dead. Lucien inherited the title shortly afterward when his father suffered a fatal stroke. The tragedy had become one of those old aristocratic stories whispered during dinners and forgotten after dessert. If he is alive, Rosalie asked slowly, then where has he been? Lucien looked toward the fire. Hidden. The words settled heavily into the room. Rosalie moved closer unconsciously. By who? Lucien's jaw tightened. My father. Confusion crossed her face instantly. Lucien noticed. The Duke before me knew someone intended to kill Daniel. His voice remained calm, but something painful moved beneath it now. Older grief. Older guilt. He hid the child before anyone else realized the heir had disappeared. Rosalie stared at him in disbelief. Then why let the world believe Daniel died? Lucien gave a tired, humorless smile. Because dead heirs are safer than living ones. Silence followed. Outside, wind rattled the windows sharply enough to shake the candle flames. Rosalie looked toward the locked east wing doors. Everything inside Blackmere Manor suddenly felt connected now. The burned records, the poisoned medicine, the desperate race to transfer control of the estate before Lucien recovered. Somebody feared the truth hidden beneath the Blackmere inheritance. Does Lady Vivian know? Lucien's expression turned cold immediately. No. Rosalie frowned faintly. Then why would she want you gone? Lucien leaned back slowly against the chair, exhaustion pulling shadows deeper beneath his eyes. Because she believes I changed my will recently. Rosalie waited quietly. Lucien looked toward the dark bookshelves lining the room. 3 months ago, I began moving portions of Blackmere holdings into protected trusts. Why? Because someone started stealing from the estate years ago. His gaze returned to hers. And I finally realized the theft reached deeper than money. Rosalie thought about the missing ledgers downstairs. The controlled fire. Carter. Whitmore. It all pointed toward something larger than inheritance. Something organized. You think your sister discovered the changes to the will? Lucien nodded once. And she panicked. The room fell quiet again. Rosalie crossed slowly toward the tea tray and poured fresh water into a clean basin, simply to steady her thoughts. The Duke watched her in silence while she worked. After several moments, he spoke again. I never intended for you to become involved in this. Rosalie paused slightly beside the table. I opened the east wing door myself. You should not have had to. The quiet honesty in his voice unsettled her more deeply than anger would have. Rosalie looked down at the cloth in her hands. I could have left like everyone else. Lucien studied her for a long moment. But you did not. No accusation. No praise. Just truth. Something warm and uncomfortable shifted inside her chest unexpectedly. She changed the subject too quickly. If Daniel is alive, does he know who he is? Lucien's eyes darkened slightly. No. You are certain? My father hid him with another family outside London under a different surname. Rosalie stared at him. And only you knew? Lucien gave a faint nod. My father told me the truth before he died. The firelight flickered across his face, revealing exhaustion that went far beyond illness now. He made me swear Daniel would remain hidden until the people responsible for his disappearance were gone. Rosalie lowered herself slowly into the chair across from him. You think those people are still inside this house? Lucien looked directly at her. I know they are. The certainty in his voice sent another chill through her. Silence stretched between them while rain whispered softly outside. Somewhere deep within the manor, a grandfather clock chimed 7 times. Evening had fully settled across Blackmere now. Rosalie noticed Lucien pressing one hand subtly against his ribs as though fighting another wave of weakness. His breathing had roughened again during the conversation. Fever still lingered beneath his skin despite the improvement earlier. You need rest, she said quietly. Lucien looked almost irritated by the reminder. You continue repeating that, because you continue ignoring it. To her surprise, another faint, almost laugh escaped him. Short, roughened by exhaustion, but real. Rosalie stared slightly. The expression softened the severe lines of his face for only a second before disappearing again. You are difficult, Miss Everhart. So are you. Lucien watched her quietly after that. Not with the distant indifference powerful men usually reserved for servants. Something else now. Something more focused. Rosalie suddenly became painfully aware that they were alone together in a locked east wing while darkness settled across the manor outside. She stood too quickly and moved toward the medicine cabinet. You should take more water. Lucien did not argue this time. That unsettled her almost more than the silence. She poured fresh water carefully while he watched the fire in tired thought. What happens if Lady Vivian discovers you are awake? She asked eventually. Then she accelerates whatever plan she already started. Rosalie handed him the glass carefully. And what do we do? Lucien took a slow drink before answering. We find Daniel before Vivian realizes he exists. Rosalie felt unease tighten slowly through her stomach. How? Lucien looked toward the desk beside the fireplace. There was a second ledger hidden inside my study. The one they locked. Yes. His gaze hardened slightly. It contains the location of the family who raised Daniel. Rosalie understood immediately. The burned records downstairs had not been random. Vivian and Carter were searching for something specific. They simply had not found the correct ledger yet. If they discovered Daniel, she could not finish the sentence aloud. Lucien did it for her. Then the last true Blackmere heir disappears permanently. The fire crackled sharply between them. Rosalie looked down at the water glass trembling slightly in her hands. This had grown far beyond estate theft and forged documents. A child had been hidden for 20 years while powerful people waited for the chance to erase him completely. Footsteps suddenly echoed faintly outside the east wing corridor. Both froze instantly. Rosalie extinguished 2 nearby candles without thinking while Lucien straightened slightly in the chair despite exhaustion. The footsteps approached slowly this time. Deliberate. Then stopped directly beyond the locked doors. Silence. Rosalie held her breath completely still. A voice finally drifted through the corridor. Carter. The housekeeper claims the Duke remains unconscious. Another voice answered quietly. Dr. Whitmore. His fever should have worsened again by now. Carter lowered his tone further. Then perhaps someone interrupted the treatment schedule. Rosalie's pulse hammered painfully hard. Lucien's expression went dangerously still. The footsteps moved again. Closer now. Chains rattled softly at the far entrance to the east wing. Testing the locks. Rosalie looked instinctively toward Lucien. He raised one finger silently toward his lips. Another long silence followed. Then Carter spoke again outside the doors. Double the watch tonight. Dr. Whitmore sounded nervous. You think someone entered the wing? I think rich men do not survive this long by accident. Rosalie felt cold spread through her chest. Carter continued quietly. And if Lucien Blackmere wakes before the transfer papers are signed, The rest of the sentence disappeared beneath another rattling chain. Then footsteps slowly retreated through the corridor darkness once more. Silence returned. Heavy. Suffocating. Rosalie finally exhaled shakily. Lucien remained motionless in the chair for several seconds afterward. Then exhaustion seemed to crash over him all at once. His shoulders sagged slightly beneath the dark wool blanket draped across them. Color drained again from his face. Rosalie crossed toward him immediately. "You are getting worse again." Lucien closed his eyes briefly. "No." His voice sounded rough now. "Just tired." But she saw his hand trembling faintly against the armrest. Fever had begun climbing again beneath his skin. She touched his forehead gently. "Hotter than an hour ago." Concern tightened through her chest immediately. "You need to lie down." This time Lucien did not argue at all. That frightened her more than the fever. Rosalie helped him carefully back toward the bed. Even weakened, he remained heavy with solid strength beneath the fever and exhaustion. One arm settled briefly around her shoulders for balance as they crossed the room. The warmth of him startled her unexpectedly. Lucien lowered himself slowly onto the mattress, breathing harder afterward. Rosalie adjusted the blankets carefully across him, while candlelight flickered low around the room. "You should sleep now," she whispered. Lucien's eyes remained fixed on her face. Fever bright again, but clear. "If I do not wake." "Do not say that." The sharpness in her voice surprised both of them. Silence followed instantly. Rosalie looked down quickly. "Sorry." Lucien watched her for one long quiet moment. Then he reached weakly toward her hand resting beside the blanket. His fingers closed around it before she realized what was happening. Warm. Rough. Steady despite the fever. Rosalie froze completely. Lucien's eyes slowly drifted shut while still holding her hand lightly against the blankets. His voice dropped lower. Exhausted. Honest in a way powerful men rarely allowed themselves to sound. "I heard you stay." Rosalie did not move for a very long time after Lucien fell asleep holding her hand. The fire had burned low beside the windows. Midnight shadows stretched across the walls of the east wing chamber while wind whispered softly through cracks in the ancient manor stone. Everything felt quieter now. More dangerous because of it. She looked down at the Duke's hand resting loosely around hers against the blankets. Rough skin. Warm despite the fever. Powerful hands built for war and authority now trembling faintly in sleep from exhaustion. Nobody had ever held her hand gently before. Not in 23 years. Rosalie carefully tried pulling away once. Lucien's grip tightened instinctively even asleep. His breathing roughened slightly. "Do not." The words slipped from him half-conscious. Rosalie froze immediately. After another few seconds his grip loosened again. She remained beside the bed anyway, because somehow leaving suddenly felt cruel. Dawn arrived gray and silent over Blackmere Manor. The storm had finally passed during the night, leaving frost silvered across the cliffs and ice clinging to the manor windows like spiderweb glass. Rosalie had fallen asleep briefly in the armchair beside the fireplace when hurried knocking echoed through the east wing corridor. She woke instantly. Lucien opened his eyes at nearly the same moment despite the exhaustion weighing visibly across him. The knock came again. 3 quick taps. Then Mrs. Weatherby's voice whispered urgently through the doors. "It is me." Rosalie crossed the room quickly and unfastened the chains just enough to allow the housekeeper inside. Mrs. Weatherby slipped through immediately before locking the corridor again behind her. She looked pale. Frightened. "They are preparing the ballroom." Lucien pushed himself upright slowly against the pillows. "For what?" The housekeeper wrung her hands tightly together. "Lady Vivian announced a gathering tonight." Rosalie frowned. "A gathering?" Mrs. Weatherby nodded miserably. "A formal dinner. She invited the neighboring families and several estate trustees this morning." Lucien's expression hardened instantly. "Why?" The answer came softly. "To announce that you are no longer capable of managing Blackmere affairs." Silence crashed through the room. Rosalie looked toward Lucien immediately. The temperature in the chamber seemed to drop around him. Not from fever this time. Fury. Cold-controlled fury. Mrs. Weatherby lowered her voice further. Mr. Carter arrived with legal documents before sunrise. They intend to place estate authority temporarily under Lady Vivian's control until... She could not finish the sentence. She did not need to, until Lucien died. The Duke swung his legs slowly toward the edge of the bed despite obvious weakness still draining color from his face. Rosalie moved toward him immediately. No. Lucien ignored her completely. What time is the dinner? 7 o'clock. Mrs. Weatherby looked increasingly alarmed. Your Grace, you cannot possibly appear downstairs. Lucien planted both feet against the floor carefully. Watch me. The movement cost him. Rosalie saw it instantly. His hand tightened hard against the mattress while dizziness swept visibly across his face. But he stayed upright through sheer force of will alone. That frightened her more than the fever ever had. Men like Lucien Blackmere did not collapse because they refused to believe collapse was an option. Rosalie crossed closer instinctively. You are still sick. Yes. His voice remained calm, which means Vivian believes she already won. He looked toward the frost-covered windows. That mistake ends tonight. The rest of the day passed beneath rising tension inside the manor. Word of the evening gathering spread quickly through the remaining staff. Servants rushed through hallways relighting chandeliers and polishing silver, while whispers traveled faster than footsteps beneath the high ceilings of Blackmere. Everyone believed Lady Vivian intended to announce the Duke's decline publicly before witnesses. Nobody expected Lucien Blackmere to survive the week. That assumption became their greatest mistake. Rosalie spent the morning helping Lucien regain enough strength to stand without shaking. The fever still lingered beneath his skin, but the dangerous confusion from earlier days had faded completely now. His mind had become sharp again, focused. Every hour he seemed more like the feared Duke whispered about throughout England. Quiet, controlled, watching everything. By afternoon he had moved from the bed to the armchair beside the fire without assistance. By sunset he crossed the room alone. Slowly, but alone. Rosalie stood nearby pretending not to notice the strain each step cost him. Lucien noticed anyway. You look at me like I am made from glass. Rosalie folded another clean shirt carefully across the chair. You nearly collapsed twice today. Only twice. His voice carried the faintest trace of dry amusement. Rosalie looked toward him despite herself. Lucien stood near the windows dressed once again in dark trousers and a black waistcoat, though he remained pale against the candlelight. Without the sickbed and restraints surrounding him, the room changed around his presence immediately. Larger somehow, more dangerous. The Iron Duke had returned piece by piece over the last 24 hours. She could see it in the way servants lowered their eyes when bringing trays upstairs now. Fear had begun returning to Blackmere Manor. But not toward disease. Toward him. Lucien fastened the cuff of his sleeve slowly before looking toward her again. You still think I should stay hidden tonight? Yes. Why? Rosalie hesitated, then answered honestly. Because they tried to erase you once already. Silence followed. Lucien studied her quietly from across the room. And yet you came back anyway. The words settled unexpectedly deep beneath her ribs. Before she could answer, another knock sounded through the corridor. Thomas entered carrying fresh coal for the fireplace. The young footman nearly dropped the bucket when he saw Lucien standing beside the windows fully dressed. Color drained from his face immediately. Your Grace. Lucien inclined his head once. Calm. Controlled. Thomas stared openly for several stunned seconds before lowering his eyes quickly. Forgive me, sir. I thought that I was dying? Lucien finished evenly. Thomas swallowed hard. Yes, Your Grace. The Duke walked slowly toward the desk without breaking eye contact. Even weakened, his presence filled the room completely now. An understandable assumption, he said quietly. Thomas looked terrified. Rosalie almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Lucien stopped beside the desk where the surviving ledgers remained hidden beneath blankets and old correspondence. Tell me something honestly, Thomas. Yes, Your Grace. How many people downstairs believe Lady Vivian already controls Blackmere? The footman hesitated dangerously long. Lucien's gaze sharpened slightly. "Speak." Thomas lowered his eyes further. "Almost everyone, sir." Silence followed. Then Lucien gave a slow, thoughtful nod. "Good." Thomas blinked in confusion. Rosalie did too. Lucien noticed neither reaction. "Fear makes people careless," he continued calmly. "Careless people reveal things." The footman left several minutes later, looking shaken enough to forget the coal bucket entirely near the fireplace. After the door closed, Rosalie turned toward Lucien. "You planned this." "Parts of it." He reached carefully toward the desk drawer and removed a silver pocket watch. "Vivian needed to believe I remained unconscious long enough to expose her allies." Rosalie stared at him. "You let them think you were helpless." Lucien looked toward her over the edge of the watch. "Sometimes the fastest way to learn who betrayed you is to become weak in front of them." The answer lingered heavily between them. Rosalie suddenly understood why people feared him so deeply. Not because he shouted. Not because he threatened. Lucien Blackmere watched quietly until people destroyed themselves. Evening settled fully across the manor by 6:30. Candlelight flooded the ballroom downstairs while carriages arrived one after another through the frost-covered courtyard. Rosalie watched from the east wing windows as wealthy guests disappeared beneath the grand entrance archways wrapped in velvet and fur. Laughter drifted faintly upward through the freezing air. Music followed shortly afterward. A string quartet. Elegant. Civilized. Meanwhile upstairs, Lucien Blackmere fastened the final button of his black coat in complete silence. Rosalie stood beside the fire, unable to stop watching him. Not because of the title. Because he no longer looked sick. Dangerous men rarely did. The dark formal coat sharpened the broad lines of his shoulders. Silver glinted faintly at his cufflinks beneath candlelight. His dark hair remained slightly longer than fashion preferred from days spent bedridden. But somehow that only made him look more severe. More untouchable. Lucien adjusted one sleeve slowly before speaking without looking at her. "You should stay here tonight." Rosalie blinked. "What?" His eyes lifted toward hers in the mirror. "The ballroom will not be safe once I appear." Cold slid slowly through her stomach. "You think Lady Vivian will react badly?" A humorless expression crossed his face. "I think desperate people become reckless." He reached for his gloves calmly. "And I would prefer you nowhere near the fallout." The quiet protectiveness in his voice unsettled her unexpectedly. Rosalie lowered her gaze quickly. "I am only a maid." Lucien went still beside the mirror. Slowly he turned toward her completely. "No." The single word landed with frightening certainty. Rosalie looked back up. Lucien crossed the room toward her with measured steps, still slightly weakened by the fever, but steady enough now to tighten the air around him. He stopped directly in front of her, close enough for candlelight to catch silver beneath his gray eyes. "You are the reason I am alive to walk downstairs tonight." The honesty in his voice stole every prepared response from her mind. Silence stretched between them. Then another knock echoed through the corridor. Mrs. Weatherby's nervous voice followed immediately. "Your Grace, the guests have assembled." Lucien's gaze remained fixed on Rosalie another second longer before he finally stepped back. The moment broke instantly, but something had changed inside it. Rosalie could feel it. Lucien pulled on his gloves slowly. Then he looked toward her once more and said quietly, "Come downstairs with me." Her breath caught slightly. "What?" "I asked you to stand beside me tonight." Rosalie stared at him in disbelief. "In the ballroom?" "Yes. Your guests will see me. That is generally how ballrooms function." Despite everything, shockingly, the corner of his mouth almost moved again. Not quite a smile. "Close." Rosalie shook her head immediately. "I cannot." Lucien's expression sobered. "Why?" The answer escaped before she could stop it. "Because women like me do not stand beside men like you." Silence filled the room instantly. Lucien looked at her for one long, unreadable moment. Then he spoke so quietly she almost missed the words. "Perhaps that is the first thing in this house I intend to change." Downstairs, The ballroom doors opened beneath golden candlelight while conversations drifted elegantly through Blackmere Manor. Lady Vivian stood near the orchestra platform wearing midnight blue silk and diamonds bright enough to blind half the room. Carter lingered nearby beside several estate trustees already holding champagne glasses. Wealthy guests whispered together beneath chandeliers while servants moved silently through the crowd carrying silver trays. Nobody noticed the ballroom doors at first when they opened again. Then the music faltered. One violin stopped completely mid-note. A champagne glass shattered somewhere near the east wall. And slowly, every conversation inside Blackmere Manor died. Because Duke Lucien Blackmere had just walked into the ballroom alive. Nobody moved. The ballroom remained frozen beneath towering chandeliers while Duke Lucien Blackmere stood framed in the open doorway like something returned from the dead. Candlelight flashed across black marble floors and crystal glasses held motionless halfway to lips. One woman near the orchestra dropped her fan completely. Another guest crossed himself before realizing what he was doing. Rosalie stood half a step behind Lucien near the entrance, suddenly aware of every eye turning toward them. Toward him first, then slowly toward her. Lucien did not appear to notice the silence swallowing the room. Or perhaps he simply expected it. He removed his gloves with calm, measured movements while guests stared openly in disbelief. Tall, pale from recent illness but standing straight regardless. The black formal coat sharpened every hard line of him beneath the ballroom light. Men who had spent the last 3 days discussing his death now looked openly frightened to discover him alive enough to walk back into his own house. Lady Vivian recovered first. Rosalie watched the exact second shock disappeared behind aristocratic composure again. Her sister-in-law's smile returned carefully. Too carefully. Lucien. Her voice floated softly across the ballroom. What a surprise. Lucien looked toward her at last. Clearly, the single word cut through the room with enough cold authority to silence even the orchestra completely. Carter stood beside Lady Vivian near the champagne table, looking visibly pale now. Dr. Whitmore appeared worse. The physician had gone almost gray beneath the candlelight. Lucien's gaze moved across both men slowly. Calmly. Rosalie suddenly understood why people compared him to winter storms. Not loud. Not wild. Controlled destruction felt more dangerous somehow. Lucien descended the ballroom staircase one measured step at a time. Guests moved aside automatically without being asked. Nobody wanted to stand in his path. Rosalie followed carefully behind him, painfully aware of servants staring from every corridor entrance. She should not have been here. Every instinct screamed that truth at her now. Maids did not walk beside dukes through grand ballrooms while aristocrats watched. But Lucien never once looked back to see if she followed. He simply assumed she would remain beside him. That frightened her in ways she did not understand. Lady Vivian recovered enough to lift her champagne glass gracefully. You should be resting. Lucien stopped several feet away from her. And miss my own funeral preparations? A few guests exchanged deeply uncomfortable glances. Carter lowered his eyes immediately. Lady Vivian laughed lightly, though tension sharpened the sound around the edges. You misunderstand. We gathered only because your illness alarmed everyone. Lucien's gray eyes settled briefly on the legal documents resting near Carter's elbow. How thoughtful. Silence stretched again. Rosalie noticed something then. Nobody approached Lucien directly. Not even the wealthy estate trustees standing nearest. Fear lived inside the ballroom now. Real fear. Because the Duke standing before them looked like a man quietly memorizing every betrayal committed during his weakness. Lucien turned slowly toward the orchestra platform. Music stopped. The conductor nearly jumped. Yes, Your Grace. Continue. The orchestra obeyed immediately. Violins resumed trembling melodies beneath the chandeliers, while conversations slowly returned around the edges of the ballroom. But the atmosphere had changed completely now. Nobody laughed comfortably anymore. Nobody relaxed. Lucien Blackmere had entered the room alive, and every person hiding secrets suddenly remembered it. Lady Vivian stepped closer with controlled elegance. You truly should not be downstairs in your condition. Lucien looked at her calmly. My condition appears greatly exaggerated. Rosalie nearly looked away when their eyes met. Nothing warm existed between these siblings. Only history sharp enough to bleed through silk and manners. Lady Vivian's gaze shifted then, slowly, deliberately, toward Rosalie standing beside him. For the first time that evening, irritation cracked visibly across her polished expression. And who exactly allowed a servant into a private family gathering? The question sliced through the ballroom softly enough for nearby guests to hear anyway. Several aristocratic women immediately glanced toward Rosalie with open disdain. Rosalie felt heat crawl painfully up her neck. She lowered her eyes automatically. Old habits. Invisible girls survived longer that way. Then Lucien spoke. I did. The room quieted again almost instantly. Lady Vivian smiled faintly, coldly. Surely you do not intend for household staff to mingle with our guests. Lucien removed one glove completely before answering. Rosalie Everhart remained in this manner when nearly everyone else fled. His voice stayed calm, even deadly because of it. That alone grants her more loyalty than most people currently standing in this room. Nobody breathed for one long second. Rosalie stared at the ballroom floor in shock. Nobody had ever defended her publicly before. Not once in her entire life. Lady Vivian's expression hardened immediately. She is still a maid. Lucien looked toward her slowly. And yet she was the only person inside Blackmere Manor who remembered I was human while you prepared inheritance papers downstairs. The silence afterward turned suffocating. One elderly trustee coughed awkwardly into his sleeve. Another guest suddenly found the champagne table extremely interesting. Lady Vivian's face lost all remaining warmth. You are confused from fever. Lucien stepped closer toward her. Not aggressively. Somehow that made it worse. No. His gaze remained fixed on hers. I became clear-headed the moment people stopped lying quietly around me. Rosalie could feel the entire ballroom listening now. Servants paused near every doorway. Even the musicians played softer beneath the tension gathering through the room. Lady Vivian folded her hands carefully together. Perhaps we should discuss this privately. No. Again that single cold word. You wanted witnesses tonight. Lucien glanced slowly around the ballroom. Now you have them. Carter finally stepped forward nervously. Your Grace. Surely there has been some misunderstanding regarding the estate transfer discussions. Lucien turned toward him with terrifying calm. The discussions involving forged incapacity documents? Carter visibly blanched. Nearby guests exchanged alarmed whispers immediately. Lady Vivian's composure cracked slightly at last. Lucien. His attention shifted back toward her. Did you truly believe chains on a hallway door would keep me unconscious forever? Rosalie saw it then. Fear. Real fear crossing Lady Vivian's face for the first time all evening. She covered it quickly, but not fast enough. Lucien noticed too. The Duke's expression did not change at all, which somehow made him more frightening. A servant hurried nervously past carrying fresh champagne. Lady Vivian turned sharply toward Rosalie instead of answering Lucien directly. Perhaps this girl misled you during your illness. Rosalie froze immediately. Lady Vivian stepped closer with silk whispering softly across the marble floor. Servants hear fragments of conversations and invent stories around them constantly. Lucien's gaze sharpened dangerously. Careful. But Lady Vivian ignored him completely now. Her eyes remained fixed coldly on Rosalie. Tell me, Miss Everhart, did you enjoy pretending to matter upstairs while my brother was delirious? The words landed like slaps wrapped inside velvet. Several aristocratic women nearby smiled faintly behind their champagne glasses. Rosalie felt humiliation rise hot beneath her skin instantly. Old humiliation. Familiar humiliation. The kind poor girls learned to swallow quietly. I asked her a question. Lady Vivian's voice hardened further. Or perhaps maids at Blackmere now consider themselves ladies. Rosalie opened her mouth once. Nothing came out. Because this was exactly how powerful women destroyed girls like her. Publicly. Elegantly. Slowly. Then Lucien moved. One step only. But the ballroom temperature seemed to drop instantly around him. He positioned himself beside Rosalie with calm, terrifying precision before speaking. "You will speak to her with respect." Silence crashed down across the ballroom again. Lady Vivian stared openly at him. "Excuse me?" Lucien's voice never rose. It did not need to. "Rosalie Everhart saved my life while this family prepared legal documents beside my sickbed." Every word landed cleanly, deliberately. "So you will address her accordingly." The room remained utterly still afterward. Rosalie could barely breathe. Guests stared between them in complete disbelief now. Not because Lucien defended her once. Because he continued doing it publicly without hesitation. Lady Vivian's expression finally hardened completely into something ugly beneath the diamonds and silk. "You embarrass yourself defending a servant." Lucien looked toward her with absolute calm. "No." His eyes flicked briefly toward Rosalie beside him. "I embarrass everyone who abandoned me." Another silence followed. Then somewhere near the west side of the ballroom, an elderly duchess quietly set down her champagne glass and murmured, "Well." The single word broke the tension just enough for whispers to erupt softly around the room. Guests exchanged looks, questions, calculations. Power inside Blackmere Manor had shifted again tonight, and everyone could feel it happening in real time. Carter suddenly moved toward Lady Vivian and whispered something urgently near her shoulder. Rosalie caught only one phrase. "The ledger." Lucien heard it too. His eyes sharpened immediately. Lady Vivian glanced toward the ballroom entrance for half a second too long. Then she smiled suddenly. Calm again. Too calm. "Perhaps you are correct, Lucien." The sudden agreement felt wrong immediately. Lucien clearly sensed it too. "What are you doing?" Lady Vivian tilted her head slightly. "Nothing at all." Then she looked directly at Rosalie. "Although I do wonder where your loyal maid disappeared earlier this afternoon." Cold slid instantly through Rosalie's stomach. Lucien's expression darkened. "Explain." Lady Vivian's smile widened faintly. "One of the downstairs clerks claims he saw Miss Everhart removing documents from your private study." The ballroom quieted again immediately. Rosalie stared at her in shock. "That is not true." Lady Vivian ignored her completely. "Perhaps your devoted servant became curious about Blackmere finances during your illness." Carter stepped forward smoothly now. "We also discovered a missing ledger shortly after the record's fire." Lucien's gaze snapped toward Rosalie instantly. Not accusing, calculating, thinking. But the movement hurt anyway. Rosalie felt it sharply. Lady Vivian saw that too. Satisfaction flickered briefly across her face. "It appears your maid may not be as innocent as you believed." Another wave of whispers spread through the ballroom. Servants near the walls looked horrified now. Rosalie's pulse hammered painfully beneath her ribs. This was the trap. Lady Vivian could not destroy Lucien publicly anymore. So she would destroy the girl standing beside him instead. And for the first time since entering the ballroom, Rosalie realized every eye inside Blackmere Manor had turned directly toward her. The silence after the accusation felt worse than shouting. Rosalie stood motionless beneath the ballroom chandeliers while whispers spread softly around her like smoke through dry wood. Wealthy guests watched openly now. Curious, judgmental, interested in scandal the way aristocrats always were when the ruined person standing in front of them belonged to a lower class. Lady Vivian remained perfectly calm beside the champagne table, one gloved hand resting lightly against the crystal stem of her glass, as though she had not just thrown a servant girl into public disgrace. Carter looked equally composed. Dr. Whitmore avoided eye contact completely. Rosalie felt suddenly cold despite the heat from hundreds of candles surrounding the ballroom. Lucien did not speak immediately. That frightened everyone more. He stood beside Rosalie with one hand resting behind his back, expression unreadable beneath the golden light. Calm, still, dangerous because of it. Finally his gaze shifted toward Carter. "You claim a ledger disappeared." Carter nodded carefully. "Yes, Your Grace. And you believe Miss Everhart took it. A clerk reported seeing her near your study this afternoon." Rosalie found her voice at last. I never entered the study. Lady Vivian tilted her head slightly. Then perhaps you should explain why several servants saw you wandering restricted hallways during my brother's illness. The trap tightened neatly around her. Rosalie realized that now. Invisible girls became suspicious the moment powerful people needed someone disposable. Lucien looked toward Rosalie slowly. His eyes met hers directly. Did you take anything from my study? No. The answer came instantly because it was true. Lucien held her gaze another second longer. Then he turned calmly back toward the ballroom. Then the accusation ends here. Lady Vivian's smile vanished completely. Lucien, you cannot seriously defend her without investigation. I can. His voice remained quiet. Watch me. Another heavy silence settled across the room. One of the trustees shifted uncomfortably near the orchestra platform. Carter stepped forward carefully. Your Grace, with respect, the missing ledger contains critical financial information regarding estate transfers. Lucien's expression hardened slightly. Interesting. Carter hesitated. Why? Lucien moved one measured step closer toward him. Because only 3 people knew that ledger existed. His gaze drifted briefly toward Lady Vivian, then Whitmore, then back toward Carter again. And none of them were maids. The room chilled instantly around the words. Rosalie saw fear flash briefly across Carter's face before disappearing behind polite composure again. Lucien noticed too. The Duke folded one glove slowly between his fingers while the orchestra played trembling music somewhere behind the tension filling the ballroom. Perhaps we should search servant quarters immediately, Lady Vivian suggested smoothly. If Miss Everhart is innocent, she has nothing to fear. Humiliation swept hot across Rosalie's skin again. Public searches. Public suspicion. This was how rich families destroyed poor women without ever raising their voices. Lucien looked toward his sister with quiet disbelief. You intend to drag a servant girl through public humiliation to conceal your own mistakes? Lady Vivian's eyes flashed coldly. I intend to protect Blackmere interests. Lucien stepped closer still. Not aggressively. Worse, controlled. No. His voice dropped lower. You intend to frighten everyone in this room into forgetting you tried stealing my estate while I was unconscious. Gasps rippled softly across the ballroom. Lady Vivian's composure cracked visibly this time. You are delirious, and yet somehow coherent enough to walk downstairs before you sign the transfer papers. Carter interrupted quickly before the situation worsened further. Perhaps emotions are running high tonight. Lucien's gaze snapped toward him sharply enough to silence the man instantly. Do not interrupt me again. The command landed like steel. Carter stepped back without another word. Rosalie stared at Lucien beside her. She had never witnessed power used this way before. No shouting. No threats. He simply expected obedience, and the room bent around that expectation automatically. Lady Vivian recovered again with visible effort. Very well, she said coldly. If you refuse to investigate your maid publicly, perhaps private questioning would satisfy everyone. Lucien's expression turned lethal. No one questions her without me present. The entire ballroom went still again. Rosalie felt dozens of shocked stares land directly on her. Because this had stopped resembling casual defense now. This looked personal. Dangerous. Intimate in ways aristocratic society would never forgive easily. Lady Vivian clearly realized that too. Her eyes narrowed slowly toward Rosalie. You have become remarkably attached to household staff very quickly. Lucien did not even blink. Loyalty should create attachment. You may have forgotten that. The words struck harder than any public insult could have. Lady Vivian's face went white beneath the candlelight. Before she could answer, a servant suddenly rushed into the ballroom from the west corridor looking terrified. My lady! He stopped abruptly after seeing Lucien standing alive among the guests. Shock crossed his face instantly. Your Grace. Lucien looked toward him calmly. What is it? The servant swallowed hard. There has been an accident outside. Carter stiffened immediately. Lucien noticed. What kind of accident? A carriage overturned near the north gate during the frost. The servant looked visibly shaken. One of the estate clerks was inside. Rosalie felt cold spread instantly through her chest. The missing clerk. The servant lowered his voice. He survived, sir. But before collapsing, he kept repeating the same thing. Lucien's gray eyes sharpened dangerously. Speak. The servant glanced nervously toward Lady Vivian and Carter before answering. He said someone burned the records because the real heir was alive. Silence crashed through the ballroom so violently even the orchestra stopped again mid-note. Carter went pale. Dr. Whitmore nearly dropped his champagne glass. Lady Vivian stood completely still beneath the chandeliers, diamonds glittering cold against her throat. Rosalie slowly turned toward Lucien. The Duke's expression had gone terrifyingly calm now. The kind of calm that existed directly before destruction. Lucien looked toward the servant without raising his voice at all. Where is the clerk now? The downstairs infirmary, Your Grace. Lucien nodded once. Then his attention shifted slowly across the ballroom toward Carter. Interesting evening, is it not? Nobody answered. Nobody dared. Lucien stepped away from Rosalie for the first time since entering the ballroom. Mrs. Weatherby. The housekeeper appeared instantly near the servant corridor as though waiting for the command. Yes, Your Grace. Escort Miss Everhart upstairs. Rosalie looked toward him immediately. What? Lucien's eyes found hers briefly. Something cold and protective moved behind them now. Go to the east wing and lock the doors behind you. Unease tightened sharply through her stomach. Why? Lucien glanced once toward Carter. Then Lady Vivian. Then the ballroom entrance leading toward the dark manor corridors beyond. Because desperate people become dangerous when secrets start collapsing around them. Lady Vivian laughed softly. Too softly. Surely you are not implying anyone here would harm a servant girl. Lucien looked directly at her. I am implying nothing. The ballroom temperature seemed to drop again. I am warning you. Another silence followed. Then Lucien turned toward Rosalie one final time. His voice lowered just enough for only her to hear clearly beneath the whispering ballroom. Do not leave the east wing tonight unless I come for you myself. The seriousness in his tone frightened her instantly. Rosalie wanted to argue. Instead she nodded once. Because something inside Blackmere Manor had shifted dangerously during the last few minutes. The missing clerk survived. The heir rumor escaped into the ballroom. And now Lucien Blackmere looked like a man preparing for war. Mrs. Weatherby hurried Rosalie quickly from the ballroom before more questions erupted. But even while crossing the crowded corridors, Rosalie could still feel eyes following her through the manor. Aristocrats whispered behind gloved hands while servants exchanged frightened looks near the walls. By the time they reached the staircase leading toward the east wing, Blackmere Manor no longer felt like a wealthy estate. It felt like a house seconds before lightning struck it directly. Mrs. Weatherby locked the corridor chains behind them with trembling fingers. Stay inside tonight, the housekeeper whispered urgently. Something terrible is coming. Rosalie looked back toward the distant ballroom music echoing faintly below. What is Lucien doing? Mrs. Weatherby's expression darkened. Taking his house back. The older woman hurried away moments later, leaving Rosalie alone once more inside the cold east wing corridor. Silence settled heavily around her again. The locked doors. The dark windows overlooking frozen cliffs. The distant music downstairs sounding increasingly strained beneath the tension. Rosalie crossed slowly back into Lucien's chamber and closed the bedroom doors behind her. The room still carried traces of his presence everywhere. Half-empty medicine glasses beside the fireplace. Black gloves discarded across the desk. The silver pocket watch resting open near surviving ledgers, hidden beneath blankets. Rosalie moved automatically toward the fire and added another log with shaking hands. Something felt wrong. Deeply wrong. Lucien would not have sent her upstairs unless he genuinely believed she was in danger. The realization settled coldly through her chest. A sudden sound interrupted her thoughts. Soft footsteps, directly outside the chamber door. Rosalie froze instantly. Silence followed. Then came a quiet knock. Not Mrs. Weatherby. Too careful. Too deliberate. Rosalie stared toward the doorway without moving. Another knock echoed softly through the room. Then a man's voice drifted through the wood. Calm. Polite. Familiar. Miss Everhart. Carter. Rosalie's pulse jumped painfully. She backed away from the door immediately. Carter continued speaking gently from the corridor. His Grace requested the missing ledger brought upstairs for review. Lucien would never send Carter alone now. Rosalie remained silent. Another pause followed outside. Then Carter spoke again. Softer this time. Colder beneath the politeness. Open the door, Miss Everhart. The fire crackled sharply behind her while silence swallowed the east wing again. Then slowly, very slowly, Rosalie realized the corridor chains were no longer rattling in the wind outside. Someone had already unlocked them. Rosalie backed slowly away from the bedroom door while Carter waited silently outside. The fire snapped softly beside the windows. Wind hissed against the frozen glass overlooking the cliffs. Every sound inside the east wing suddenly felt painfully loud. Another knock echoed through the chamber. Calm. Patient. Miss Everhart, Carter called again. You misunderstand the situation. His Grace simply requested the ledger returned privately before guests become alarmed downstairs. Rosalie stared at the locked door without answering. Her pulse hammered hard enough to make her dizzy. Because Lucien would never send Carter here alone. Never. She glanced quickly toward the desk near the fireplace where surviving ledgers remained hidden beneath folded blankets and scattered correspondence. Then another realization struck her cold. If Carter believed she possessed the missing ledger, then someone downstairs wanted him to believe it. The accusation at the ballroom had not only been humiliation. It had been distraction. A trap designed to isolate her upstairs away from Lucien. Carter's voice lowered slightly beyond the door. Colder now. Less polite. Open the door, Miss Everhart. I would rather avoid unpleasantness. Rosalie looked quickly around the chamber. One entrance. Tall windows overlooking a 40-foot drop to frozen stone below. No escape. Another sound interrupted the silence then. Footsteps approaching from farther down the east wing corridor. Fast. Carter heard them too. Rosalie could tell by the sudden quiet outside the door. Then Lucien's voice cut through the corridor like winter steel. Move away from that door. Silence crashed through the east wing instantly. Rosalie closed her eyes briefly in relief so sharp it almost hurt. Carter recovered first. Your Grace. Lucien's footsteps stopped directly outside the chamber now. You appear confused regarding your position inside this house, Mr. Carter. Calm. Controlled. Terrifying because of it. Carter tried again carefully. I merely came to retrieve estate property. No. Lucien's voice dropped lower. You came upstairs alone after accusing an innocent woman publicly because you believed fear would make her easier to isolate. Rosalie heard another set of footsteps approach. Mrs. Weatherby. Then Thomas. Servants gathering. Witnesses. Carter clearly realized it too. His voice tightened faintly. You misunderstand my intentions. I understand them perfectly. Pause followed. Then Lucien spoke again. Quieter this time. Far more dangerous. And if you touch that door again, I will have you removed from Blackmere before sunrise. Silence. Then slowly, Carter's footsteps retreated down the corridor. Mrs. Weatherby exhaled shakily afterward. Thomas muttered something too quiet for Rosalie to hear. Finally the door opened. Lucien entered the chamber first. Candlelight from the corridor flashed briefly across his black formal coat before the door shut behind him again. Rosalie stared at him in silence. The ballroom tension still clung visibly to him somehow. Cold fury wrapped beneath aristocratic control. Lucien looked toward her immediately. Are you hurt? The question startled her. No. He studied her another second anyway, as though verifying the answer himself. Only after seeming satisfied did he glance toward the desk where the ledgers remained hidden. Good. Mrs. Weatherby entered next carrying visible panic beneath her composure. Your Grace. The guests downstairs are beginning to ask questions. Lucien removed his gloves slowly. Then let them ask. Thomas lingered nervously near the doorway. Sir, there is something else. Lucien looked toward him. Speak. The young footman swallowed hard. The clerk from the carriage accident regained consciousness. Rosalie felt the room tighten instantly around the words. Lucien's expression sharpened. And he wants to speak with you personally. Thomas hesitated dangerously long before continuing. He claims he knows who hid the heir. Silence followed. Even the fire seemed quieter suddenly. Lucien stood motionless beside the desk while shadows from the flames moved sharply across his face. Where is he now? The downstairs infirmary. Thomas looked pale again. But Lady Vivian already sent Dr. Whitmore to examine him alone. Lucien moved immediately toward the door. Rosalie stepped forward instinctively. You cannot go alone. He looked back toward her. I am not alone. The answer came without hesitation. Something shifted unexpectedly inside her chest. Mrs. Weatherby spoke quickly before the silence deepened. Your Grace, perhaps Miss Everhart should remain here. Lucien's eyes remained fixed on Rosalie instead. No. Quiet certainty. She comes with me. Mrs. Weatherby looked startled. Thomas looked terrified. Rosalie herself forgot how to breathe for a second. But Lucien had already opened the chamber door again. Stay behind me while we cross the corridors, he said calmly. And do not speak unless necessary. Then he walked into the east wing hallway without waiting to see whether she followed. Rosalie did anyway, because somehow she always did now. The manor corridors downstairs had changed completely since the ballroom confrontation. Guests whispered openly near candlelit alcoves while servants rushed nervously between rooms carrying messages no one explained aloud. Fear lived inside Blackmere Manor tonight. Not fear of sickness anymore. Fear of secrets collapsing. The moment Lucien appeared at the top of the grand staircase beside Rosalie, conversations below died again almost instantly. Wealthy guests lowered their voices. Estate trustees stepped aside automatically. Nobody challenged the Duke now, because the frightening truth had become clear to everyone inside the manor. Lucien Blackmere had survived long enough to start hunting the people who betrayed him. Rosalie followed one step behind him through the crowded corridors toward the infirmary wing. Eyes tracked her openly now. Curious. Judgmental. Shocked that the maid publicly defended by the Duke continued walking beside him like she belonged there. She hated the attention. But Lucien never once slowed his pace or asked her to leave. The infirmary doors stood half open near the West Hall. Dr. Whitmore emerged just as Lucien approached. The physician stopped abruptly beneath the candlelight. Your Grace. Lucien's expression remained unreadable. You were examining the clerk. Whitmore adjusted his spectacles nervously. Yes. Alone. The patient was unstable. Lucien stepped closer. And now. Whitmore hesitated. Too long. He is resting again. Rosalie felt cold move sharply through her stomach. Lucien noticed too. Move aside. Whitmore tried once more. Perhaps tomorrow would be wiser. The clerk requires quiet. Lucien stopped directly in front of him. You injected me repeatedly while I was unconscious. The physician went pale instantly. Your Grace, I assure you the treatments were medically necessary. Lucien's gray eyes remained steady. Then you will not object to me reviewing your medical supplies personally. Whitmore said nothing, which was answer enough. Lucien entered the infirmary without another word. Rosalie followed immediately behind him. The room smelled strongly of medicine and smoke. One elderly clerk lay unconscious beneath heavy blankets near the fireplace, face bruised from the carriage accident but breathing steadily. Beside the bed stood an open medical case filled with glass vials and syringes. Lucien crossed toward it instantly. Rosalie watched his jaw tighten the moment he examined the unlabeled bottles inside. The same dark sediment floated near the bottom of one vial. The same bitter metallic smell. Whitmore spoke too quickly behind them. Sedatives only. Lucien looked toward him slowly. Interesting. He lifted the vial slightly beneath candlelight. Because this is not a sedative. Whitmore's face drained white. Rosalie saw it clearly now. Fear. Real fear. Lucien set the bottle down carefully. Thomas. The footman jumped immediately near the doorway. Yes, Your Grace. Send riders into town. Bring the magistrate here tonight. Whitmore stepped backward instantly. You cannot seriously believe. Lucien cut him off with one cold look. I believe you poisoned me while my sister attempted to seize Blackmere authority. Silence. Heavy. Final. Whitmore's hands began trembling visibly now. I never intended harm. Lucien's voice remained terrifyingly calm. That is unfortunate. Because harm occurred anyway. The unconscious clerk stirred weakly in the bed beside them then. Rosalie moved instinctively closer. The man's eyes fluttered open halfway beneath the candlelight. Confusion crossed his bruised face before recognition followed. The Duke. Lucien stepped toward the bedside immediately. You asked to speak with me. The clerk swallowed painfully. They burned the records because of the boy. Lucien's expression hardened. Daniel. The clerk nodded weakly. Your father hid proof inside the chapel vault years ago. Rosalie frowned slightly. What proof? The clerk looked toward Lucien. The birth registry. The inheritance seal. Everything proving Daniel Blackmere survived. Silence filled the infirmary again. Lucien spoke carefully. Who else knows? The clerk's breathing roughened. Carter. Fear crossed his bruised face now. And Lady Vivian found the vault key yesterday morning. Rosalie felt cold spread through her chest instantly. Lucien noticed too. The chapel. His voice dropped lower. Dangerous. They are going after the documents tonight. The clerk grabbed weakly at Lucien's sleeve suddenly. Sir. Lucien looked down. The older man's voice trembled. Your father trusted the wrong people inside this house. Lucien stood completely still for one long second after hearing that. Then he nodded once. I know. He turned sharply toward Thomas. Prepare the carriage. Whitmore stepped forward immediately. Your Grace. The roads are dangerous after the storm. Lucien's gaze snapped toward him coldly. So are traitors. Then he looked toward Rosalie beside him. Candlelight flickered sharply across his exhausted face. Fever still lingered faintly beneath his skin despite everything. But his eyes had become iron now. Focused completely. You are staying here. Rosalie stared at him. No. The answer escaped instantly. Lucien blinked once as though surprised by the force of it. Rosalie. If Lady Vivian reaches those documents first, she destroys Daniel forever. Her pulse hammered painfully. You said yourself they want the heir erased. Silence stretched tightly between them while servants watched nervously from the doorway. Finally Lucien exhaled slowly. Tired. Defeated by her stubbornness perhaps. You are impossible. Despite the danger surrounding them, Rosalie nearly heard amusement beneath the words again. Almost. Then his expression darkened once more. Stay beside me once we leave the manor. The command came quietly. Protective. Certain. Rosalie nodded once. Outside, wind began rising across the cliffs again. And somewhere beyond the frozen darkness surrounding Blackmere Manor, the final proof of the true heir waited inside an old chapel vault while desperate people raced toward it from every direction. The carriage wheels cut sharply through frozen mud as Blackmere Manor disappeared behind them into the storm-darkened hills. Wind slammed against the black carriage hard enough to rattle the windows while horses strained through icy roads leading north toward the abandoned chapel. Inside, silence wrapped tightly around the small space between Rosalie and Lucien. Candlelight from the carriage lantern swung softly across his face with every violent turn of the wheels. He looked pale again. Exhaustion had carved deep shadows beneath his eyes after the confrontation downstairs. Fever still lingered faintly beneath his skin despite his control over it. But nothing about him appeared weak now. Not anymore. Lucien Blackmere sat across from her wearing black gloves and winter wool with the stillness of a man preparing himself for something final. Rosalie held the edge of the carriage seat tightly as freezing rain streaked against the glass. How far is the chapel? 20 minutes. His voice remained calm. If the roads stay clear. Rosalie glanced toward the storm outside. And if they do not? Lucien looked toward her steadily. Then we walk. The answer should have frightened her. Instead it only made something inside her chest tighten painfully. Because he meant it. Even sick. Even betrayed by his own blood. He would drag himself through snow and darkness before allowing Daniel Blackmere to disappear. The realization hurt in ways she could not explain. Another sharp turn jolted the carriage violently. Rosalie caught herself against the wooden wall just as Lucien reached forward instinctively to steady her arm. Warm fingers closed briefly around her wrist. Strong despite exhaustion. Neither spoke immediately afterward. Lucien released her slowly. Sorry. Rosalie shook her head quickly. You do not apologize often, do you? A faint, almost smile touched the corner of his mouth before disappearing again. No. Silence settled once more. Outside, thunder rolled low across distant cliffs while pine forests blurred dark beyond the frozen windows. Rosalie looked toward him carefully. Why did you really bring me tonight? Lucien's gaze shifted toward the storm. Because you notice things other people miss. That is not the real reason. He looked back toward her then. Candlelight flickered silver across his eyes. Tired eyes. Honest now in a way powerful men rarely allowed themselves to become. No. The word came quietly. Rosalie waited. Lucien's jaw tightened faintly before he continued. I brought you because I trust you. The carriage suddenly felt too small. Too warm despite the winter surrounding them. Rosalie lowered her eyes quickly toward her folded hands. Nobody had ever trusted her with anything important before. Not really. Servants carried trays. Scrubbed floors. Disappeared quietly into hallways after wealthy people finished speaking. They were useful. Invisible. Replaceable. But trust belonged to other kinds of women. Not girls raised in cold servant quarters who learned silence before childhood ended. Lucien watched her quietly from across the carriage. That surprises you. Rosalie gave a faint, humorless laugh. People usually trust me to clean fireplaces. Something painful flickered briefly across his expression. Then the carriage lurched violently to a stop. Both looked sharply toward the front window. Thomas's voice called from outside through the storm. Your Grace. Lucien opened the carriage door immediately. Wind exploded into the small space carrying snow and freezing rain hard enough to sting skin. Rosalie stepped out beside him onto frozen ground overlooking a dark hilltop chapel surrounded by dead winter trees. Lantern light flickered weakly across ancient stone walls and broken stained glass windows half buried beneath snowdrifts. But they were not alone. Another carriage already waited beside the chapel entrance. Lucien went completely still beside her. Vivian. Rosalie's pulse quickened painfully. Snow whipped violently around them while Thomas struggled to control the horses behind. Lucien took one step forward toward the chapel doors. Then another. Calm. Controlled. Dangerous. Rosalie hurried after him through the storm. The chapel entrance stood partially open. Candlelight flickered faintly inside against old stone walls covered in dust and shadow. The moment Lucien entered, voices stopped abruptly beyond the sanctuary. Rosalie followed directly beside him and saw them immediately. Lady Vivian stood near the altar wearing a dark wool cloak over her ballroom silk. Carter lingered beside her holding an iron key. And near the far wall, Dr. Whitmore nervously searched through a half-open stone vault hidden beneath the chapel floor. Papers scattered everywhere around them. Ledgers. Old records. Torn envelopes. Lucien's voice cut through the chapel silence like a blade. Step away from the vault. Lady Vivian turned slowly toward him. No surprise crossed her face this time. Only exhaustion. Cold exhaustion. You always were difficult to kill. Rosalie felt the room freeze around the words. Carter looked horrified she had spoken them aloud. Whitmore stepped backward immediately from the vault. Lucien did not react visibly at all, which somehow made him more frightening. You poisoned me. Lady Vivian removed one glove carefully. No. Her gaze drifted briefly toward Whitmore. I merely allowed weak men to solve problems badly. Whitmore looked sick now. Truly sick. My lady. Be quiet. The sharpness in her voice silenced him instantly. Snow hissed against broken chapel windows while candle flames trembled around the sanctuary. Lucien stepped farther inside. "Where are the documents?" Lady Vivian smiled faintly, bitterly. "Still protecting a child who never even knew your name." Something shifted behind Lucien's eyes then. Older grief. Older guilt. Daniel was 6 years old. And beloved. Her voice hardened instantly. "Do you know what it is like growing up beside a perfect golden heir?" Rosalie stared at her in disbelief. Lady Vivian laughed softly. Empty sound. "Father adored him. The estate adored him. Even the servants adored him." Her eyes sharpened toward Lucien. "But you understood, did not you? You knew the moment Daniel disappeared that everything inside Blackmere changed." Silence filled the chapel. Lucien spoke quietly. "Father never trusted you afterward." Lady Vivian's composure cracked at last. "No." Anger flashed sharply across her face. "He trusted you instead." The quiet second son nobody noticed suddenly became protector of the family legacy. Tears glimmered briefly in her eyes before hardening into fury again. "Do you know what father told me before he died?" Lucien remained still. Lady Vivian's voice dropped lower. "He said Blackmere would survive only if I never touched it." The chapel went silent except for storm winds screaming outside. Rosalie understood then. This was never only greed. It was rejection twisted into bitterness for 20 years. Lady Vivian looked toward the open vault. "I searched every room in that manor after father's death, trying to prove he was wrong about me." Her expression hollowed strangely. "Then I discovered Daniel survived." Carter stepped forward nervously. "My lady, we should leave." She ignored him completely. Her eyes remained fixed on Lucien now. "Do you know what hurt most?" Lucien said nothing. Lady Vivian's voice trembled finally. "You never told me the truth either." The grief inside the chapel suddenly felt heavier than anger. Rosalie saw it clearly now. A broken family destroying itself around one vanished child and decades of silence. Lucien's jaw tightened slowly. Father believed someone inside Blackmere betrayed Daniel's location. Lady Vivian laughed sharply through gathering tears. "And you suspected me immediately." Silence answered her, which was answer enough. Her face crumpled briefly before hardening once more. "So I became exactly what everyone already believed." Whitmore looked increasingly terrified beside the vault. "This has gone too far." Lucien's gaze shifted toward him instantly. "You poisoned me for money." Whitmore backed away another step. "Carter threatened to expose my debts." Carter snapped immediately. "You agreed willingly." "Enough." Lucien's voice cracked through the chapel hard enough to silence everyone. Snow roared outside the broken windows while candlelight shook violently across ancient stone walls. Then slowly, Lucien walked toward the open vault. Carter moved instinctively to block him. Huge mistake. Lucien stopped directly in front of the man. No raised voice. No threat. Just cold certainty. "Move." Carter did. Immediately. Rosalie watched Lucien kneel carefully beside the scattered documents, hidden inside the chapel floor. His hands moved through old papers with controlled precision until finally he stopped. One envelope remained sealed beneath the others, bearing the Blackmere crest pressed into dark wax. Lucien stared at it silently for several long seconds before opening it carefully. Inside rested a birth certificate, a signed inheritance decree, and a small photograph of a dark-haired boy smiling beside the cliffs below Blackmere Manor. Daniel. Lucien closed his eyes briefly after seeing the picture. Rosalie felt something twist painfully inside her chest at the expression crossing his face. Relief, grief, guilt, love. 20 years hidden inside one moment. Then footsteps exploded suddenly outside the chapel entrance. Magistrates, riders from town. Thomas's voice followed through the storm. Lady Vivian went still immediately. Carter looked trapped. Whitmore nearly collapsed into the pew beside him. Lucien rose slowly, holding the documents in one gloved hand. The chapel doors burst open moments later as town officials entered carrying lanterns and winter cloaks heavy with snow. Everything afterward blurred strangely fast. Questions. Orders. Carter escorted away, pale with panic. Whitmore trembling beneath accusations he could no longer deny. Lady Vivian standing motionless near the altar while magistrates approached her carefully like people approaching broken glass. Through it all, Lucien remained silent, watching, exhausted beyond words now that the fight keeping him alive had finally ended. Rosalie stood quietly near the chapel wall, feeling suddenly invisible again beneath all the chaos. Which was fine. Familiar. Safer that way. She slipped toward the entrance unnoticed while officials crowded around Lucien and the recovered documents. Snow drifted softly across the chapel steps outside. The storm had finally begun fading into silence. Rosalie wrapped her coat tighter against the cold and stepped away from the doorway before anyone realized she was leaving. Rosalie! She stopped instantly. Lucien stood behind her at the chapel entrance, snow swirling softly around the dark lines of his coat beneath lantern light. The magistrates waited respectfully farther inside now, giving the Duke space automatically. Lucien descended the chapel steps slowly toward her. He looked exhausted, pale from illness and sleepless nights and too many years carrying secrets alone. But for the first time since she met him, he also looked free. Snow settled quietly in his dark hair while silence stretched between them beneath the winter sky. Rosalie lowered her eyes first. Everything is finished now. Lucien studied her for a long moment. No. She looked back up slowly. Lucien stepped closer. Everything begins now. The wind softened around them. Somewhere behind the clouds, dawn threatened the horizon faintly silver. Rosalie felt suddenly uncertain again. About the manor. About herself. About where invisible girls belonged after stories ended. "You do not need me anymore," she whispered. Lucien's expression changed instantly. Not anger. Something far quieter. Far more dangerous to her heart. Rosalie Everhart. He said her full name the way other men spoke vows. Steady. Certain. "The last time I was left alone, I nearly died." Her breath caught softly. Lucien reached toward her carefully then, slow enough for her to step away if she wished. His gloved hand settled gently against her cold fingers instead. Warm. Steady. Chosen. "I think," he said quietly beneath the falling snow, "I should prefer if you stayed."